Calvin Mercer didn't even bother to lower his voice. He stood in the middle of Ridgeline's only street, surrounded by 3 of his hired men, and laughed loud enough for every person within 100 yards to hear him. The stagecoach had barely rolled to a stop when he spotted her. A large woman in a plain brown dress climbing carefully down from the coach steps, gripping the rail with both hands because the step was steep and the ground was uneven. "Well, I'll be," Mercer said, loud and deliberate. Silas Boone ordered himself a mail-order bride and got a barrel with shoes on. The laughter came fast and mean. His men joined in first, then a few idlers near the general store, then the woman behind the millinery counter who should have known better. The stagecoach driver stared at his boots. Nobody told Mercer to stop. The woman on the step paused. She looked out at the crowd with steady brown eyes, and for just a moment the whole street went quiet. Not because they felt ashamed, but because they were waiting to see if she'd cry. She didn't. She turned back to the coach and reached inside for her bag. If you're watching this and you've ever been the person everyone underestimated, stay with us, because this woman is about to make every single one of them regret it. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story has traveled, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Stories like this one don't come around often. The morning Silas Boone rode into Ridgeline to meet the stagecoach was the worst morning of a very bad month. He hadn't slept. There were black circles under his eyes, deep enough to cast shadows, and his coat was stiff with dried mud from the night before, when he'd spent 3 hours in a frozen pasture trying to keep a cow on her feet long enough for dawn. She hadn't made it. That made 11. 11 cattle dead in 6 weeks, and the ranch hands who hadn't quit yet were moving with the slow, careful energy of men who were already deciding when they'd leave. Silas was 34 years old and looked 45. He tied his horse at the post outside the post office and stood with his hat in his hands, watching the road where the stagecoach would come from. He'd written the letter to the agency in Denver 3 months ago, during a different kind of desperate. Back then, he thought it was embarrassing, admitting in writing that he needed a wife the same way a man needs a good pair of boots. Practical, necessary, not something he had time to find himself. Now embarrassment felt like a luxury. Now he just needed someone who could cook and keep books, and maybe not run screaming when the first hard winter hit. He hadn't asked for much. Willing to work. Sturdy enough for mountain life, not afraid of cattle. He hadn't asked for what he was about to get. He heard Mercer before he saw him, that voice like a man who'd learned early that volume could replace substance. Calvin Mercer was 48, thick-set across the shoulders, with a silver watch chain that he adjusted whenever he wanted to remind someone he had money. He ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, owned 2 of the 3 buildings on the main street, and had made 3 separate offers to buy Broken Summit Ranch in the past 2 months. Each time Silas had said no, Mercer had smiled like a man who wasn't worried about patience. He was standing near the stage stop with 2 of his ranch hands and a man in a gray suit who Silas recognized as Jonas Reel, the land attorney who worked out of Mercer's back office. That didn't mean anything good. Silas crossed the street slowly, and Mercer saw him coming and didn't adjust his stance even a little. That was the thing about Mercer. He never moved to accommodate anyone. People moved around him like water around a stone, and he'd grown so used to it that he'd stopped noticing. "Boone," he said by way of greeting. "Mercer." Silas looked at the attorney. "Reel." Jonas Reel gave a thin smile and studied the horizon. "Heard you're expecting company today," Mercer said. Silas didn't answer. There were no secrets in a town this small, and he'd stopped being surprised by that years ago. He tucked his hat under his arm and watched the road. "Brave thing," Mercer continued, conversational, like they were talking about the weather. "Bringing a woman into that situation you've got up there. What are you down to now? 14 head? 15? That's my business." "Sure it is, for now." Mercer smiled at his hands, then back at Silas. "You know the offer still stands. Same number I gave you in November. I've been patient because I'm a patient man, but I'll tell you honestly, Silas, every week that passes, those numbers get harder to justify. Dead herd, banknote coming due in." He tilted his head as if calculating, 30 days, give or take? Silas felt something tight move through his chest. "I said that's my business." Mercer rocked on his heels. "It's a hard thing, watching a ranch die slow. Your father built that place. I remember when it was something. It's a shame, is what it is." before Silas could respond to that, and he wasn't sure what he would have said, because the rage and the grief had gotten so tangled together lately, he couldn't separate them. The sound of the stagecoach reached them from around the bend. The crowd that gathered was typical for stage day. A dozen people or so clustered near the post office and the general store, waiting on mail or packages or relatives. Silas stood at the edge of it, stomach in knots, hat still under his arm. The coach swung around the corner and came to a stop in a cloud of frozen dust, and the driver climbed down and opened the door, and 3 passengers emerged in sequence. A young man with a carpet bag who immediately started looking for someone, an older man in a black coat who moved with purpose toward the hotel, and then a pause, just long enough to notice. And then Martha Calloway stepped down. Silas registered this in the plain, observational way of a man trying not to react, larger than he'd expected. Not just tall, not just broad, but full-figured in a way that was immediately, visibly obvious. Her dress was sensible cotton in a deep brown, her coat was good quality, but worn, and her dark hair was pinned up under a traveling bonnet that had seen better days. She was perhaps 30 years old, though it was hard to say. Her face was, and this surprised him, he wasn't sure why, intelligent. Not beautiful in the way the agency photographs had implied, but awake, alert, like a woman who was always noticing things. She gripped the coach rail, stepped down carefully to the ground, and looked out at the assembled crowd with the calm expression of someone who'd been looked at before. Mercer spoke before Silas could move forward. "Well, I'll be." The voice, projected, amused. Silas Boone ordered himself a mail-order bride and got a barrel with shoes on. The laughter came fast, and Silas felt it like a physical thing, a wave of sound washing over the street. He saw Martha's expression shift, just fractionally, something tightening around her eyes, and then she turned back to the coach without a word and reached up for her bag. Silas was already moving. "Enough," he said, not loudly, walking past Mercer without looking at him. He reached the coach and stopped in front of Martha Calloway and put his hat back on his head and said, "You're Martha. I'm Silas Boone." He extended his hand. She looked at his hand, then at his face, and shook it with a firm grip. "I know," she said. "You look like a man who hasn't slept since October." It was such an unexpected thing to say that he almost laughed. "About right," he admitted. Behind him, Mercer said something to Reel in a low voice, and both men laughed again. Silas kept his back to them deliberately. "I have 2 trunks," Martha said. "They're heavy. I'll need help." "There are 2 trunks," the driver confirmed, opening the luggage compartment. He lifted the first one and immediately, visibly, staggered. "Lord above, what's in this?" "Books," Martha said, "and equipment." "Equipment," the driver repeated. "Yes." Silas helped wrestle both trunks onto the wagon. They were extraordinarily heavy for their size. He glanced at Martha as they lifted the second one, and she met his eyes without explanation, and he got the distinct impression she wasn't going to offer one until she was ready. The wagon ride out of town took 40 minutes on a frozen dirt road that wound up through pine-covered slopes into the higher elevation where Broken Summit sat. Silas drove, Martha sat beside him, and they both looked at the road ahead for the first several minutes without speaking. Then Martha said, "How many head did you start with?" 62. "And now?" He paused. 12? Maybe 13. I lost one last night." She absorbed this without obvious reaction. "What does the sickness look like? Describe it to me from the beginning." He looked at her sideways. "You know cattle." "Describe it to me," she said again, quietly, but completely without apology. So he did. He told her about the first 2 that had dropped in late October, the strange lethargy before the more dramatic symptoms, the way the sick animals' coats dulled before anything else showed, the gut distension, the unusual discharge. He told her about the veterinarian from Boise who had ridden up in November, looked at 2 dead cattle, shrugged, and said sometimes disease just moved through a herd and there was nothing to be done. He told her about the remedies he'd tried. He'd burned through money on 3 different patent treatments, none of which had made any difference. Martha listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Where does your herd water?" she asked. "The spring at the north pasture, mostly. There's a creek in the south field, but it runs slow in winter, so he stopped. Something in her stillness made him stop. What? Nothing yet. She looked out at the mountains coming up around them. I want to see the spring. Why? Because your neighbors aren't sick, she said, and they share the same sky and the same altitude and probably the same parasites. What they don't share is your water source. Silas opened his mouth and closed it again. The wagon climbed. The ranch came into view first as smoke, two thin columns rising from the main house and the bunkhouse, and then as a collection of dark shapes against the white slope. The barn, the outbuildings, the corrals, the low-slung house that Silas's father had built 30 years ago with his own hands and bad lumber that he'd later replaced board by board. 3 ranch hands came out to meet the wagon. Pete Gruber, who was 50 and weathered and had been on the ranch since Silas was a child. Danny Holt, who was 22 and strong and currently looking at Martha with the politely controlled expression of a young man trying not to show what he was thinking. And Frank Sola, the newest hand, who was 35 and had come up from Nevada and who showed no expression at all, just looked at the trunks. Help with those, Silas said, jumping down. What's in them? Danny asked, grabbing one side. Books, Martha said from the wagon. She climbed down slowly, measuring the drop, and landed solidly. And scientific equipment. Danny and Frank exchanged a look over the trunk. Pete said nothing. Pete watched Martha with the patient, evaluating look of a man who'd spent decades reading animals and weather and decided to apply the same approach to people. Martha looked around the yard. Her eyes moved. And Silas was watching this, he noticed it, with that same quick cataloging attention she'd used on him. Not nervous, not overwhelmed, calculating. Show me the sick cattle, she said. You want to see your room first? Silas asked. After, she said. The cattle first. Pete led them to the far barn where the sickest animals were separated from the healthy ones. The smell hit before the door was fully open. Not death, not yet, but something close to it. The particular thick medicinal and rot smell of serious animal illness. Danny and Frank stayed near the door. Pete went in without hesitation. Martha walked straight to the nearest animal and crouched down beside it with a slowness dictated by her body's proportions, careful, deliberate, and began examining the cow's eyes, her gums, her hooves. How long has this one been down? She asked. 4 days, Pete said. And the ones that died, were they all down approximately 4 days before the end? Give or take. Martha pressed 2 fingers against the cow's abdomen and the animal flinched weakly. She pulled her fingers back, looked at them, then looked at Pete. Has any of the manure been dark? Almost black with a kind of, yes, Pete said slowly. She looked up at him. You noticed that? I noticed things, Pete said simply. For the first time since she'd arrived, something in Martha's face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but a warmth around the eyes. Good, she said. I'm going to need that. She stood up from the crouch with obvious effort, one hand bracing on her knee, and looked at Silas standing in the barn doorway. The spring. I need to see it before the light goes. It's a 20-minute walk, he said. There's snow. I know, she said. Lead the way. The walk to the North Spring was not easy. The path went up a slope that was manageable in summer but punishing in February, with crusted snow that looked firm and wasn't. Silas went first, testing each step. Pete followed. Martha came third, and she was slower than both of them, her heavier frame breaking through the snow crust where their boots hadn't, and she fell once, caught herself on both hands, knees plunging into the powder, and was back on her feet before either man could turn fully around to help her. She didn't say anything about it. She got up and kept walking. The spring was a seep rather than a proper spring. Water rising up through a rocky depression, collecting in a natural basin, feeding down through a channel that the previous owner of the ranch had improved with stones and packed earth into something resembling a trough system. It was partially frozen now, but the center still moved. Martha crouched beside it and looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she reached into her coat pocket, which was deeper and more complex than Silas had noticed before, and removed a small glass vial in a leather case. She collected a sample of water from the moving center, sealed the vial, and tucked it carefully away. Then she looked along the edges of the snowbank surrounding the basin. There, she said. Silas followed her gaze. There was nothing there that he could see. Snow, rocks, the dark outline of the stone border. There's nothing. Come look, she said, not challenging, just directing. He came to where she was crouched and looked down at what she was indicating. There was, barely visible, under an overhang of crusted snow, a darkening of the rock face, a staining, something that didn't match the clean white and gray of the surrounding stone. What is that? Silas said. I'm not certain yet, Martha said. She was looking at it with the intensity of someone reading a letter in dim light. I need my instruments, but I have a theory, and I want to make sure I'm right before I tell you what it is. Why? She looked at him. Because if I'm right, it changes everything. And I don't want to say that to you unless I can prove it. They walked back to the ranch in the half-dark, Silas's mind working over the staining on the rock, over the question of what it could mean, over the strange quality of calm that Martha Calloway seemed to carry with her like a second coat. That night, she ate supper with the hands without appearing to notice that Danny was openly baffled by her, and Frank was performing indifference with visible effort. She asked Pete questions about the timeline of the sickness, when the first animal showed symptoms, what the sequence had been, whether any of the cattle that watered at the South Creek had ever gotten sick. Pete answered everything directly. At some point during the meal, Silas realized that Pete and Martha were deep in a conversation about water mineral content that he couldn't entirely follow, and that Pete was no longer performing patience. He was genuinely engaged. After supper, Martha asked where she'd be sleeping, and Silas showed her to the small room off the kitchen that had been used for storage and which he'd cleared out and put a decent bed and a washstand into. It was plain but clean. She thanked him without looking at him because she was already opening one of the heavy trunks. Silas stood in the doorway and watched her lift out a leather-wrapped bundle with the careful, familiar handling of someone unpacking something precious. Inside were glass instruments, delicate things, tubular and calibrated, that he didn't have names for. What is all of that? He asked. She set a microscope on the small table beside the window. It was a proper brass microscope, compact but complex, the kind he'd only ever seen in a magazine illustration. She set it on the table like she'd set it on that same table 100 times before. My work, she said. Your work, he repeated. Then, what kind of work does a woman who answers a bride advertisement bring a microscope to? She was quiet for a moment. The lantern light moved across the brass of the instrument. I'll explain it properly tomorrow, she said, when I have something to show you. Why not now? She looked at him then, and her expression was what? He searched for the word and landed on serious. Not defensive, not apologetic. Serious, the way a doctor looks at a patient before delivering news that requires preparation. Because right now you're exhausted and you're angry and you're frightened, she said, and those are reasonable things to be, but they're not useful for what I need to tell you. In the morning you'll still be frightened, probably, but you'll have slept, and that makes listening easier. He should have been irritated by that. Instead, he found he had nothing to say. He nodded. He went to bed. He didn't sleep much anyway. What he did was lie in the dark and stare at the ceiling and think about the staining on the rock by the spring, and about the way Martha Calloway had said your ranch isn't dying because it's weak. She'd said it quietly, not dramatically. And about the sound of Calvin Mercer's laughter on the main street in the 30 days left on the banknote, and the 12 cattle he had left that were still alive. In the morning, Martha was already awake when he came into the kitchen. She'd started the stove and put coffee on and was sitting at the table with a journal open in front of her, writing in a small, dense hand. 3 other journals were stacked at her elbow, all of them well-used, spines cracked, pages wavy with use. She didn't look up when he came in. He poured coffee and sat across from her and waited. After several minutes, she set down her pen and closed the journal and said, I need to tell you who I am. All right, he said. I worked for 6 years as a research assistant to Dr. Edmund Ferris at the Colorado Agricultural Experimental Station in Fort Collins, she said. Dr. Ferris is one of the leading researchers in bovine parasitology in the country. I'm not his assistant anymore. I left 18 months ago to pursue my own research, which his institution wasn't willing to fund. Silas put his coffee down carefully. Parasitology. The study of parasites. In this case, specifically, the intestinal and blood-borne parasites that affect cattle. You answered a mail-order bride advertisement, he said, because your letter described symptoms I recognized, she said, without particular embarrassment. I've been looking for a specific outbreak pattern for 2 years. I believe what's happening on your ranch is being caused deliberately. I needed a place to work from, and I needed a herd to study, and… She paused. I wasn't dishonest in my letter. I am willing to work. I am willing to be a partner to someone who needs one. I said nothing that was untrue. Silas stared at her. Deliberately, he said. You said deliberately. I said I believe it, she said carefully. I don't have proof yet, but the water sample I collected yesterday, combined with what Pete told me last night about the timeline and the sequence, the pattern is not natural. Natural die-offs don't move through a herd with that kind of regularity. They cluster and they spike and they fade. This has been steady, deliberate, like someone is managing it. The word managing sat on the table between them like something with weight. Mercer, Silas said. I don't have proof, she said again, firmly. I need 3 days in the laboratory to know what I'm dealing with, and I need to look more carefully at the spring and the land around it. She looked at him directly. I understand if this is not what you expected when you wrote to the agency. I understand if you want me to take my trunks and go back to Denver on the next stage. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like water. You think you can stop it? He said. The herd dying. I think I might be able to stop it, she said. I won't promise. I don't know yet what we're dealing with, but I think there's a chance. Silas picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the barn, at the corrals, at the slope of the mountain going up behind the ranch buildings, white and enormous and indifferent. His father had built this place. His father had died on this land, and he'd said it was the best thing he ever built, which Silas had always taken to mean more than the buildings. You're not going back to Denver, Silas said. Get what you need from your trunks. I'll take you to the spring after breakfast. Martha looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and opened the journal again. I'll need Pete, she said. He notices things. I know, Silas said. I'll tell him. By mid-morning, the table in Martha's room had disappeared under a careful arrangement of instruments, glass slides, vials of water samples, and open journals filled with charts and notations. She worked with the focused, unhurried concentration of someone who had done this many times before, and she talked Pete through each step with a matter-of-fact patience that made it clear she was accustomed to explaining her work to people who hadn't been trained in it. Danny watched from the doorway for 20 minutes before he apparently decided he had better things to do. Frank didn't watch at all. Silas came in at noon and stood behind Pete's shoulder and looked at what Martha was doing and understood almost none of it. She was examining something on a slide under the microscope and describing what she saw to Pete in terms that were unfamiliar, and Pete was writing it down in a rough hand in a notebook Silas recognized as the ranch's daily log. Can I look? Silas asked. Martha stood back from the microscope without comment and let him look through the lens. He saw something. Small things, moving, dozens of them in the light of the lens, too small to have a name for. That's from the water? He asked. Yes, she said, from yesterday's sample. Is that bad? She hesitated, and he noticed the hesitation, the careful weight she gave to the next words. Water always has organisms in it. Some of these are normal, some of these are not. She reached past him to adjust the focus, and the moving shapes sharpened. Do you see the ones with the, She described a tiny structural detail he strained to see. Those ones, there. Maybe, he said. Those ones are not supposed to be in mountain spring water, she said. Not at this density. And they are the ones that I believe, when consumed in quantity over several weeks, produce the exact symptoms you described to me yesterday. Silas straightened up and looked at her. How would they get in the water? He said. Again, the careful pause. They could come from several sources, she said. But at this concentration, this consistently, I would need to look more carefully at what's upstream of your spring. Upstream, Silas said. Mercer's land is upstream. Martha looked at him steadily. I know, she said. The afternoon brought cold and the threat of new snow on the upper slopes, and Martha bundled herself into a coat that was slightly too small across the shoulders and tramped back up to the spring with Silas and Pete. This time she brought a canvas satchel that clinked with glass when she moved, and when they reached the spring, she began working her way methodically along the bank, examining the snow and the rock and the frozen ground with a handheld lens. Silas was watching her when she stopped. She was looking at something under the snow overhang where she'd noticed the staining the day before. She got down on her knees in the snow, slowly, carefully, and he started to move to help her, and she waved him back without looking. And she reached under the overhang with one gloved hand and felt around and pulled something free. It was a sack. Burlap, the size of a small pillowcase, tied at the neck with twine, dark with moisture and half-frozen solid. She looked at it for a long moment without opening it. Then she looked up at Silas with an expression he hadn't seen on her face yet. Not excited, not triumphant, something tighter and colder than that. "Don't touch this," she said. Don't touch anything around here." She set the sack carefully on a clean patch of snow and reached into her satchel for a pair of cotton gloves, pulling them on before handling it further. "There may be more. I need to look." "What is it?" Silas demanded. "I need to look first," she said again, firmly, and she began moving along the bank on her knees in the snow, searching. Pete looked at Silas. Silas looked at Pete. "She knows something," Pete said quietly. "Yeah," Silas said. "She does." They found 2 more sacks, both hidden, both in positions that would put their contents in the water flow of the spring. Martha photographed the locations with a small portable camera that emerged from the satchel alongside everything else, working quickly in the fading light, and Silas realized he was watching something that was both scientific and procedural. She was building a record, not just examining evidence. She was doing it the way a man builds a case, careful and deliberate, thinking ahead to an audience she hadn't met yet. "What's in the sacks?" he asked when she'd finished with the camera. "I think I know," she said, "but I need the laboratory to confirm it." She was putting things carefully back into the satchel. "I need you to leave these exactly where they are. Don't move them. Don't tell anyone except Pete that we found them." "Martha." He waited until she looked at him. "What do you think is in them?" She held his eyes. The cold had put color in her face, and her hair had come partially loose from its pins under the bonnet, and she looked tired, he realized. Not from today alone, tired in the deep, banked way of someone who has been fighting something for a long time and is not yet finished. "I think someone has been seeding your water supply with infected material," she said, "deliberately over a period of weeks, long enough to build up concentration. Long enough for your cattle to be thoroughly sick before you'd think to question the water." Silas heard the words go through him in sequence, each one landing. "Who?" he said, though he knew. "I need proof first," she said. "Martha." "I know," she said quietly. "I know who you're thinking of. I need proof first, or it doesn't matter." They walked back to the ranch in the early dark. Silas's jaw set so tight his teeth ached. He kept his hands in his pockets because if he didn't, he'd do something with them. He thought about Calvin Mercer's voice on the main street, easy and amused. He thought about Jonas Reel and the 30-day notice on the banknote. He thought about his father, who had put 30 years of labor and love into this land and died believing it would be worth something to someone after him. In the barn, the sick cattle breathed slow and heavy in the dark. At the supper table, nobody talked much. Pete ate steadily and looked at nothing. Danny and Frank talked about inconsequential things in the careful way of men who could feel tension but didn't know where it was coming from. Martha ate without comment, and between bites she was writing in her journal with the small, precise handwriting that Silas was starting to recognize as her thinking made visible. After supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Martha was back in her room with the lantern burning, Silas sat at the kitchen table for a long time with his hands around a mug that had gone cold. He thought about something she'd said on the wagon ride-up when they'd first been talking about the sick herd. He told her about the veterinarian from Boise, the one who'd shrugged and said sometimes disease just moved through. And Martha, not looking at him, looking at the mountain road, had said, "Your ranch isn't dying because it's weak. It's dying because someone hasn't asked the right questions." He'd thought at the time she meant him, that she was gently, politely criticizing him for not finding the answer himself. He'd bristled at it, quietly, in the way he'd been quietly bristling at everything lately. Now he wasn't sure that was what she'd meant at all. He thought she'd meant the veterinarian, the neighbors who'd whispered about curses, the bank that had looked at his numbers and seen only default, the whole apparatus of people who had looked at his dying ranch and seen what they expected to see instead of asking whether what was happening made sense. Nobody had asked the right question. Martha had asked it in the first hour. The lantern light under her door was still burning when he finally went to bed. He could hear, faintly, the scratch of her pen. In the morning, he was going to have to figure out what to do with what she'd found. He was going to have to figure out how to fight Calvin Mercer with science and journals and glass slides, when everything in him wanted to ride into town and put his hands around the man's throat. He lay in the dark and breathed. He thought about Martha on her knees in the snow, reaching under the overhang with her careful hands and the look on her face when she'd pulled that sack free. Not surprise. Not horror. Recognition. The particular controlled expression of someone who already suspected what they would find, and now had to figure out what to do about finding it. I need proof first, she'd said. Or it doesn't matter. He understood that, intellectually. He understood it completely. It didn't make the cold rage sitting in his chest any easier to carry. But somewhere beneath the rage, running quieter and steadier, was something that was neither hope nor certainty, but something between the two. The sense that for the first time since October, someone was asking the questions that needed asking, and she wasn't going to stop until she had the answers. The lantern in Martha's room burned past midnight. Silas knew because he woke twice in the small hours, and both times saw the thin line of yellow light under her door, and both times heard the faint, irregular scratch of her pen moving across paper. The second time he woke, it was close to 3 a.m, and he lay there listening to the wind work at the corners of the house and the distant sound of cattle moving in the barn, and he thought about getting up. He didn't. There was nothing useful he could do at 3 a.m. that he couldn't do at 5, and Martha Calloway clearly did not require supervision. He was at the kitchen stove when she came out at dawn. She looked the way people look when they haven't slept. Not dramatically undone, just slightly blurred at the edges. The skin under her eyes darker than the day before, and her movements carrying that particular deliberateness of someone running on discipline rather than rest. She'd repinned her hair but missed a section at the back. She didn't appear to know. She sat down at the table with 2 journals and didn't say good morning. Silas put coffee in front of her without comment. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the journals and then at the wall behind them, which meant she was thinking rather than reading. He left her to it and started on breakfast. Pete came in from the early feeding while Silas was cutting salt pork, stomped his boots on the mat, and looked at Martha. He looked at the journals. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "Bad night?" he said. "Productive night," she said without looking up. "Those are different things." "Usually," she agreed. Pete nodded slowly and drank his coffee. That was what Pete was like. He had an economy about him, a quality of not forcing things, which Silas had always found valuable in a man, and which apparently Martha recognized immediately because she looked up from the journals for the first time and said, "I want to show you something after breakfast." "All right," Pete said. "You too," she said, glancing at Silas. "All right," Silas said. Danny and Frank came in from the bunkhouse while the pork was still in the pan, bringing cold air and the smell of hay and horses. Danny sat down and immediately looked at Martha's journals with the unconcealed curiosity of a young man who'd decided he didn't understand something and was interested in that. Frank sat down and looked at his hands. "What are those books?" Danny asked. "Research records," Martha said. "For what?" "For what I was doing before I came here." Danny processed this. "What were you doing before you came here?" "Danny," Silas said. "I don't mind," Martha said. She looked at Danny with a directness that seemed to slightly unsettle him. "I was a research assistant at an agricultural experimental station in Colorado. I studied bovine diseases, specifically parasitic diseases." Danny stared at her. "You're a scientist," he said. "I was an assistant to one," she said. "Now I'm doing my own work." "Huh," Danny said, and looked at Frank, who was still studying his hands and offered nothing. The meal was quiet. Martha ate, efficiently, without the self-consciousness Silas had half expected from someone newly arrived in a strange household. She ate like a person who was hungry and didn't have time for performance. When she finished, she stood up, picked up both journals, and said to Silas and Pete, "Bring your coats. I need to show you what I found last night." What she'd found was laid out on the table in her room with the meticulous organization of someone who thought in systems. She'd moved the microscope to one side and cleared space for a large sheet of paper on which she'd drawn, in that small, precise hand, a diagram. Silas looked at it, and at first saw only lines, but after a moment, the shapes resolved. It was a map. The ranch, the spring, the slope above it, and an annotated series of marks and notes. "Sit down," she said. There were only 2 chairs. Pete took one. Silas sat on the trunk. Martha stood at the table and pointed at the diagram without touching it. "This is the spring," she said. "This is the channel it feeds into. And these," she indicated 3 marked points, "are where the sacks are buried." "I told Pete about the sacks this morning," Silas said. Martha nodded. She'd expected that. "What's in the sacks is a mixture of infected material, fecal matter from sick cattle, combined with what I believe are artificially cultivated parasite larvae. Someone prepared this deliberately and placed it to dissolve slowly into the water source over a period of weeks." She looked at them both to make sure they were following. "It's not a crude method. Whoever did this understood enough about biology to know that a sudden massive infection would be obvious. Too many animals getting sick too fast would cause questions. But a slow, steady contamination, that looks like disease, that looks like bad luck. That's what the veterinarian from Boise saw." Pete said, "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the timeline you gave me and the degree of decomposition in the material, at least 6 weeks, possibly 8. Silas was doing the calculation. 8 weeks ago was December, shortly after Mercer had made his first offer to buy the ranch. "There's something else," Martha said. She turned to the microscope and adjusted it, then stepped back. "Look through this." Pete went first. He looked for a long time, moving the slide slightly, his face giving nothing away. "The ones that are moving fast," Martha said. "Do you see them?" "Yes," Pete said. "Those aren't native to this altitude. I've done enough field work in mountain regions to know what belongs in a high-elevation cold spring and what doesn't. Those organisms require a certain temperature range to survive. They're not surviving here accidentally. They're surviving here because someone is replenishing the supply." Pete straightened up and looked at her with an expression Silas recognized from years of watching the older man work. It was the look Pete used when he'd gotten confirmation of something he'd already half known. "Regular deliveries," Pete said. "That's my theory," Martha said. "Not a single contamination event. Ongoing management." Silas stood up. He couldn't sit still with this. He went to the window and looked at the barn and the corrals and the cattle visible through the corral fence, the surviving 12, moving slowly in the cold. "How do we stop it?" he said. "I'm working on that," Martha said. "I have some ideas about treatment for the surviving animals. But I need to be clear with you. Whatever I can do for the cattle depends on stopping the contamination first. I can treat the herd all I want, but if they're drinking from that spring, we're rebuilding on a broken foundation." "We pull them off the spring," Silas said. "Yes. Move them entirely to the South Creek for now. I know it runs slow, but it's clean." She looked at him. "And we need to document everything before we move anything. That means letting those sacks stay exactly where they are until I've gathered everything I need from them." He hated that. He hated having that material in his water source for 1 more hour, let alone the days she might need. But he understood why she was saying it, and he trusted. And this surprised him, how immediate that trust had come. He trusted her judgment. "How long?" he said. 2 days? Maybe 3? He nodded tightly. "There's one more thing," Martha said. She had been building to this, he realized, holding it until they'd absorbed the rest. "The organisms I found, they're not common. They're not something a rancher would stumble upon or a farmer would accidentally introduce. Cultivating them at the density I found in those sacks requires knowledge, equipment, a controlled environment." Pete said, "The kind of equipment a large operation might have. The kind of equipment someone with resources might pay a specialist to use," Martha said carefully. "Mercer's operation is the largest in the valley," Silas said. He turned from the window. He has a doctor on retainer. Real told me that once, bragging about it. Said Mercer keeps a man of science on staff to help manage the herd health. Martha's expression changed, not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes that indicated she was filing this away. That's useful, she said. You're going to need more than useful, Silas said. You're going to need proof that will hold up with the sheriff. Mercer owns this valley. He owns people in this valley. He paused. I'm not saying don't try. I'm saying know what you're walking into. I know what I'm walking into, Martha said, quietly and absolutely. The morning moved into afternoon with the restless, layered quality of a ranch where things were wrong and everyone knew it, but the work still had to be done. Silas helped move the remaining cattle to the South Creek, which took most of the morning and required coaxing and muscle, and Pete's patience with a roan steer that had decided it didn't want to go anywhere. Danny worked alongside Silas without asking questions, which Silas appreciated. Frank worked on the far side of the herd and said nothing to anyone, which was Frank's ordinary behavior, so Silas couldn't read anything into it. Martha spent the morning in her room and in the far barn with the sickest animals. She moved between the two with a rhythm that wasn't hurried but was absolutely without pause. Examine, record, test, adjust, go back and repeat. Silas checked on her once at mid-morning and found her crouched beside a downed heifer with a stethoscope pressed to the animal's side. Her eyes closed, listening, her face carrying the concentrated inward expression of someone translating a language most people never heard. She didn't look up. He left her to it. At noon, Pete came to Silas at the creek fence and said, without preamble, Danny thinks she's remarkable. Danny changes his mind fast, Silas said. That's because he's 22 and his mind is still flexible. Pete squinted at the cattle. I think she's remarkable too, for different reasons. Silas looked at him. She's not trying to convince us of anything, Pete said. She's just working. She knows what she knows and she's doing what she does, and she's not asking us to like it or understand it. That's a particular kind of confidence. She's hiding things, Silas said, not dishonestly. But there are things she knows that she hasn't told me yet. She'll tell you when she's ready, Pete said. She's the kind that doesn't speak until she has something worth saying. Silas thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, while he fixed a section of fence that had given way in the last storm, and split wood until his shoulders ached, and came back to the house at dusk to find Martha standing outside in the cold, looking up at the slope above the ranch. She had her coat on, and her hands were bare. She'd been outside long enough that her fingers were reddened, and she was looking up the mountain with the same fixed, particular attention she'd given the microscope, the spring, the sick cattle. You should go in, he said. She didn't respond immediately. Then she said, How often does someone from the Mercer operation ride this ridge? Silas followed her gaze. The ridge above the ranch was visible as a dark line against the sky. It was on Mercer's land, or land Mercer controlled, which wasn't quite the same thing but functioned the same way. I've seen them up there a handful of times, he said, checking the tree line supposedly, looking for stray cattle. Looking at your spring, she said. He was quiet. They'd need to resupply the contamination, she said. Regularly. Someone's been coming down that ridge with materials and getting close enough to the spring to add to what's there. She finally lowered her gaze and looked at him. We need to find the approach they're using, the path down from the ridge. If there's a path, there may be evidence of use, tracks, marks, disturbed soil under the snowpack. I can find it, Silas said. I know that ridge. In the morning, she said. Not now. Why not now? Because you've been working since before sunup and your judgment will be better in the morning, she said, in exactly the same tone she might use to tell him a calculation was off. Factual. Reasonable. Not unkind. He opened his mouth and closed it. Also, she said, moving toward the house door, I need to show you something from this afternoon's work. And I need to eat something first or I'm going to fall over. That was the most human thing she'd said since arriving, and it surprised him enough that he was still thinking about it while he set out cold biscuits and leftover stew, and they sat at the kitchen table together in the quiet of an emptied house. The hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Martha ate with the focused hunger of someone who'd genuinely forgotten to do it, until now. Halfway through the meal, she said without looking up from her bowl, I spoke to the roan heifer today. Silas paused. The one Pete calls Bella. She was agitated. I sat with her for a while. Martha looked slightly embarrassed by this, which was the first embarrassed expression he'd seen on her. It calms them sometimes when they're very sick. The company. Pete does that, Silas said. I know, he told me. She picked up a biscuit and looked at it. She's fighting. She's a fighter, that animal. She's always been stubborn, he said. Good. Martha took a bite of the biscuit. Stubborn is useful. After dinner, she showed him what she'd found in the afternoon. A sample from one of the sacks, examined under the microscope and cross-referenced against entries in 2 of her journals. She explained it slowly and clearly, without condescension, in the way of a person who's learned to translate their expertise for a general audience because they've had to do it their whole career. The organisms in the sacks were not just the same type as those in the spring water. They were at a specific developmental stage that would maximize their viability in cold water. Someone had timed the contamination with care. Whoever prepared this, Martha said, knows that mountain spring water is cold enough to kill certain larvae on contact. They used a species that tolerates cold temperatures, and they suspended them in a medium, she gestured at the dark material in the sample vial, that protects them long enough to establish in the water flow. This is beyond what a rancher does, Silas said. Far beyond, she said. This is specialist knowledge, applied deliberately. The man of science on Mercer's staff, Silas said. Possibly. She was careful with that word. I can't prove it from the organisms alone, but the knowledge required, she closed one of the journals. It narrows the field considerably. Silas sat back in his chair. The lantern between them was burning low, and the room had the close, quiet feeling of late evening in a cold house. And he was acutely aware that he was sitting 4 feet from a woman he'd known for 36 hours, who had in that time dismantled every assumption he'd made about why his ranch was dying and replaced them with something that was equal parts hope and danger. I need to ask you something, he said. Go ahead, she said. Why here? He looked at her directly. You said you recognized the symptoms from my letter. That's true for maybe a dozen ranches in 3 states, if this Mercer has been doing what we think he's been doing. Why mine? Martha was quiet for a moment. The lantern light moved. Your letter, she said finally. The way you described it. Most people who write about sick cattle describe the cattle, the numbers, the losses, the cost. She folded her hands on the table. You described what they were like before they got sick. You said your bull had a disposition like a politician and twice the stubbornness, and that the first heifer to fall was the best mother he'd ever seen on a mountain slope. She looked at him steadily. You noticed them as individual animals. That tells me something about how carefully you observe the things in your care. Silas had no ready answer for that. I thought, she said more quietly, that a man like that would let me work without standing in the way of it. They sat with that for a moment. Am I? He said. Standing in the way? No, she said. You've been surprisingly useful. He wasn't sure if that was a compliment. He decided it was, coming from her. He was up before dawn again and went directly to the ridge after a cup of coffee, leaving Pete a note about the morning feeding. The climb was difficult in the dark, snow deeper on the north-facing slopes, but he knew this mountain the way he knew the layout of the barn, not by thinking, but by the body's memory of repeated paths. He found what he was looking for 40 minutes up. A trail, faint, but there, pressed into the snow cover and the frozen ground beneath in a pattern that wasn't deer or elk. Boots. Narrower than his, spaced in the stride of someone who knew where they were going. The trail came down from the ridge at an angle that bypassed the tree line and ended at a flat rock formation that Silas recognized as a lookout point he'd used as a boy. From that rock, with the right equipment, a man could access the slope that led to the spring without ever crossing Broken Summit land directly. He followed the trail back to its origin as far as he could before the light started to go and the terrain turned treacherous. But he found what he was looking for at the turnaround point, under a deadfall pine, sheltered from weather, 3 additional burlap sacks. Unopened. Waiting. His hands clenched in his gloves. He didn't touch them. He went back down the mountain faster than was strictly safe, because the need to move was stronger than caution. and arrived at the ranch as Martha was crossing the yard with her satchel. She stopped when she saw his face. "You found something," she said. "3 more sacks," he said. "On the ridge, unused, under a deadfall about 400 yards from the lookout rock." Martha's expression did the thing he was learning to read. The controlled tightening, the internal recalibration. "He's planning to resupply," she said. "Or someone is." "Did you touch them?" "No." "Good." She looked at the mountain behind him, calculating. "I need to photograph and sample them before anyone knows they've been found. If they move the supply, they'll know we know," he said, "and we lose the evidence." She adjusted the satchel strap on her shoulder. "Can you take me up there this afternoon?" "The terrain is bad." She looked at him with the particular patience of a woman who'd spent yesterday on her knees in the snow. "I know," she said. "Can you take me up there?" He took her up that afternoon. It was a hard climb, and she made it without complaint and without pretending it was easy. She fell twice, once on a steep section where the snow gave way, and once on a patch of ice she didn't see. And each time she got up with a brief, quiet pause that he recognized as the body's way of taking inventory, and kept going. By the time they reached the deadfall, she was breathing hard and her face was red with cold and effort, but her hands were steady when she opened the satchel and began working. She photographed the sacks from multiple angles. She sampled the contents through the burlap without opening them, a technique involving a thin probe and a collection vial that she performed with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it in the field before. She measured the distance to the lookout rock and recorded it in the journal. She examined the boot prints around the deadfall with a lens, sketched them in the journal, and estimated the size. "Large feet," she said. "Larger than yours. Someone heavier." "Mercer's foreman," Silas said immediately. "Hank Pryor. He's a big man." "I can't say for certain it's him," she said. "No, but I can." She looked at him. "I know what Pryor's boot looks like," Silas said. "He has a distinctive heel. The right boot has a cracked heel plate he's never had replaced. I've seen his tracks before, around the boundary fence, in places I didn't understand at the time." Martha looked back at the prints. Then she made a note in the journal. "That could matter," she said, "in the right context." "With the right witness," Silas said. "Pete's seen Pryor's boot prints too. He mentioned it to me once. Said it was strange that Mercer's foreman was riding our fence line." Martha capped her vial and tucked it into the satchel with careful hands. "We're building something," she said. It wasn't enthusiasm, more like the voice of a person checking off items on a mental list and finding each one in place. "Slowly, but we're building it." "Mercer comes back in 3 weeks," Silas said, "with the bank people." "I know. That's not a lot of time to build something that holds up with a sheriff who's been eating Mercer's food at the cattlemen's dinners for 20 years. "I know that too," she said. She stood up from the crouch, with her hand on the deadfall for support, and her face when she straightened was drawn with effort that she didn't acknowledge. "Silas? Look at me." He looked at her. "I have been trying to prove this for 2 years," she said. 2 years of following the pattern across 4 counties, watching ranches fail, watching families lose everything, watching Mercer or someone like Mercer walk away richer each time. I have been turned out of offices and laughed at, and told that a woman of my appearance and my station has no business presenting herself as any kind of scientific authority. She held his eyes without flinching. "I did not come to your ranch to fail. I came because I finally have access to the evidence that was always just beyond my reach. I'm not going to waste it." The wind moved through the pines above them and shook loose a small shower of snow from the branches. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and picked up the satchel. The walk back down was slower than the walk up, which was always the way of mountains. They moved in silence for the first long stretch, single file, Silas breaking the snow ahead and Martha following. He was thinking about what she'd said. 2 years. He was putting together a picture of what those 2 years had looked like. The journals, the instruments, the way she carried her knowledge like something she'd had to fight for and didn't intend to put down. Halfway down, she slipped badly. The slope steeper than it looked, the snow crust deceiving. And this time she didn't catch herself. She went down hard on her left side and slid 2 yards before the ground leveled and stopped her. Silas was beside her before she'd fully registered what had happened, one hand on her arm. "I'm fine," she said immediately. "I know," he said, "but let me—" "I'm fine." She pushed up with both arms, assessed, stood. She was favoring the left hip, barely perceptibly, but he saw it. "You landed hard," he said. "I've landed harder." She adjusted the satchel and kept moving. He walked beside her the rest of the way down rather than ahead of her, and she didn't comment on this, which he took as acknowledgement. Back at the ranch, Pete met them in the yard with an expression that had a slight edge to it that Silas recognized as controlled concern. "Danny saw someone on the ridge this afternoon," Pete said, "while you were up there. Ryder on the eastern approach, watching the ranch." Silas went very still. "How long?" he said. 20 minutes, maybe." Then he turned around and rode back over. Martha said, "Was he close enough to see which direction we went?" Pete looked at her. "Possibly." "Then they know we went up the ridge," she said. She wasn't panicked. She was calculating, fast and visible, her eyes moving in that interior way. "They'll check the deadfall." "Not tonight," Silas said. "It's coming dark." "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early. Which means we don't have 2 days." She looked at him. "We have tonight." Pete said, "What do you need?" Martha looked at both of them. For just a moment, in the cold yard with the light going out of the sky behind the mountain, there was something on her face that wasn't the controlled professional composure she'd worn since she arrived. It was a person carrying a very heavy thing and recalculating whether they could carry it faster. Then the composure came back. "Lanterns," she said. "Both of you, if you're willing. I need to process everything I collected today, and I need witnesses for what I document. If we're going to take this to anyone with authority, I cannot be the only person who has seen this evidence." She looked at Silas. "And I need the ranch hands, Danny and Frank, whatever they think of me." "They'll come," Silas said. He thought of Danny's wide-eyed reaction at breakfast, the gradual shift over the day from amusement to something edgier and more interested. "Danny will come. Frank—" "I'll talk to Frank," Pete said simply. Silas nodded. That night, the 5 of them crowded into Martha's small room around the table with 3 lanterns burning, and Martha walked them through everything she'd found in sequence: the water samples, the sacks at the spring, the samples from the ridge. She explained each piece of evidence in plain language, connecting it to the next, and the room was so quiet that the lantern's hiss was audible. Danny sat with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands for a long stretch of it, staring at the microscope after his turn at the lens. "Someone did this on purpose," he said, not a question. "That's what the evidence indicates," Martha said. "Someone rode up that ridge and put poison in our water and watched these cattle die," Danny said, and his voice had a quality in it that Silas recognized. The voice of a young man encountering something genuinely evil for the first time and not quite having the framework for it yet. Week after week. "Yes," Martha said. Frank, who had said nothing since entering the room, said quietly, "Mercer tried to buy the Whitfield place last spring. The Whitfields had a sickness in their herd the winter before. I knew Tom Whitfield. He sold to Mercer for 1/3 of what the place was worth." Everyone looked at him. Frank looked at the table. "I didn't put it together," he said. "I should have." "You weren't supposed to put it together," Martha said. "That was the point." The documentation went on for 3 hours. Martha narrated each piece of evidence. Pete recorded it in the ranch log in his steady hand, and Silas and Danny and Frank signed each entry as witnesses. By the end, the ranch log had 17 pages of annotated entries covering water contamination, specimen analysis, physical evidence location, and timeline correlation. It was not a legal document, but it was a record, signed by 5 people, of what had been found and where and when. When it was finished, Martha looked at the assembled pages and let out a slow breath. "It's not enough on its own," she said, "but it's the foundation." "What do we need on top of it?" Silas asked. She looked at him. "We need the surviving cattle to recover, because a living herd is evidence that the contamination was the problem and that it's been removed. A dead herd is just a failed ranch." She gathered the journals carefully and stacked them. "And we need one more thing." "What?" "We need someone with enough standing that people will listen." She looked at her hands, then at the journals. Dr. Ferris, my former employer in Fort Collins. If I can reach him, if I can get a letter to him and get his response before the foreclosure date, his name carries weight that mine doesn't. Not yet. Write the letter tonight, Silas said. She looked at him. I'll have Pete ride to town with it at first light, he said. We'll pay for the fastest post they have. Martha looked down at the journals. Something in her face moved. Not sentiment exactly, but the recognition of something unexpected arriving. You don't know if this works, she said. No, Silas said, but you said you didn't come here to fail, and I believe you. So let's give it every chance we've got. She picked up her pen. Outside, the wind had quieted, and the mountain was dark and still, and the cattle in the far barn were breathing their slow, labored breaths. And Bella, the roan heifer, who Pete called stubborn, and Martha had sat with in the afternoon, was still alive, fighting something invisible in her blood, which maybe meant nothing and maybe meant everything. Martha wrote the letter by lantern light while Silas sat at the kitchen table and drank cold coffee and watched the door of her room and thought about all the different ways this could still go wrong. Pete rode out before sunrise with the letter in his coat pocket. Silas watched him go from the porch, the older man's figure disappearing into the gray pre-dawn with the particular unhurried certainty that characterized everything Pete did, and then stood there a moment longer with his coffee going cold in his hand before going back inside. The house had a different quality to it this morning. Not quieter exactly, but more charged, the way air feels before weather comes in. Martha was already at the table. She'd slept, he thought. She looked like a person who had slept 3 or 4 hours rather than none, which for her appeared to constitute adequate rest. She had one journal open and was eating a biscuit left from the night before without appearing to notice she was doing it, her attention entirely on the page. Pete's gone, he said. I heard the horse, she said. He sat across from her and looked at the journal, which was dense with her small handwriting interspersed with diagrams he couldn't read. How long for a reply from Ferris, if he responds? Fastest post from here to Fort Collins, and back. 8 days, if everything goes right. She turned a page. Everything rarely goes right. We have 26 days to the bank date. I know how many days we have, she said, not sharply, but with the finality of someone who has been counting the same number for a while and doesn't need reminding. He let that sit. I want to start treatment today, she said, for the surviving animals. I've been putting together a protocol based on what I know about this parasite class and what I've observed in your herd. It's not going to be simple. Some of it is going to be expensive, and I know that's— Tell me what you need, Silas said. She looked up from the journal. Tell me what you need, he said again. I'll figure out the money part. She held his look for a moment and then nodded once and looked back at the journal. I need supplies from town. Some of them you'll have to order from Boise or Denver. There are things a general store in a mountain town won't carry. I'll make you a list this morning. She paused. Some of what I need, I can make do with substitutes. I know how to adapt, but there are 2 compounds I cannot substitute, and if we can't get them, write the list, he said. We'll figure it out. She wrote the list. It covered 2 pages in her precise hand, items annotated with acceptable substitutes where they existed and marked with a star where they didn't. Silas read it at noon, sitting at the kitchen table, and felt the familiar weight of numbers settling on his chest. Not just the cost of the supplies, but the cost of everything, the banknote and the dwindling operating money, and the fact that he had 12 surviving cattle whose odds he still didn't know. Then he folded the list and put it in his coat and saddled his horse and rode to town. Ridgeline in February had the stripped-down, enduring quality of a place that had made peace with cold. The main street was half-frozen mud under a skim of new snow, the kind that looked clean until you stepped in it. The general store was warm and smelled of sawdust and tobacco, and Ambrose Kelly behind the counter was the same Ambrose Kelly who'd sold Silas's father supplies for 30 years and who looked at the list with his reading glasses perched on his nose and his lips moving slightly. Most of this I can do, Ambrose said. These 2, he tapped the starred items. I'd have to wire Denver. 3 days, maybe 4 if they have it in stock. Wire them today, Silas said. Ambrose looked at him over the glasses. This is an unusual order, Silas. It is. This is medicine. For livestock, looks like. But these are compounds I don't ordinarily stock. Who's ordering this? Silas paused because he'd anticipated this question and hadn't entirely decided how to answer it. The smart play was probably discretion. The thing he wanted to do was say his wife's name and let Ambrose Kelly and whoever was listening make of it what they would. "My wife," he said. "She has a background in veterinary science. She's treating the herd." Ambrose's eyebrows moved. "Your wife." "Martha Calloway Boone," Silas said, and the name felt strange in his mouth. They hadn't discussed names, hadn't had the formal ceremony the agency had outlined in their materials, but the naming of it felt important right now, in this room, with Ambrose Kelly's eyes slightly too knowing behind those reading glasses. "The woman who came in on last week's stage," Ambrose said. "Yes." Ambrose looked back at the list. He was quiet for a moment, in the considering way of a man who is doing more than reading a supply order. Then he set the list on the counter and said, "I'll wire Denver this afternoon. I'll have everything I have in stock ready by tomorrow morning." "I appreciate it, Ambrose." "Silas." Ambrose took his glasses off and set them on the counter too, which meant he was about to say something worth listening to. "Mercer's foreman was in here 2 days ago asking questions." Silas kept his face steady. "What kind of questions?" "About the stage, about what came off it, about the passenger list." Ambrose folded his hands on the counter. "I told him what's public knowledge, which is what he already knew, but I thought you should know he was asking." "I appreciate that too," Silas said. He bought what the store had in stock, loaded it in the wagon, and was back on the road within the hour. The whole time he was in town, he'd felt the particular exposed quality of a man who knows he's being watched from somewhere he can't see. He didn't see Mercer. He didn't see Pryor. He didn't see Jonas Reel. That didn't mean they weren't there. When he got back to the ranch, Martha was in the far barn. She'd moved a work table in there during the morning and set it up near the stall where Bella and 2 other sick animals were housed. And she was working at the table with a precision that had apparently compelled Danny to watch from the entrance of the stall, sitting on a hay bale, with his arms on his knees, his expression no longer performing anything. Frank was in the stall too, crouched near Bella's head, one hand resting on the animal's neck. Silas stood in the barn doorway and looked at this arrangement for a moment. Frank, who said little to anyone, who'd arrived from Nevada 8 months ago, and whom Silas had never fully read, Frank was talking to the heifer, too low to make out words, his big hand moving slowly on her neck. Martha looked up when she heard Silas's boots on the barn floor. She saw the supplies in his arms. Her expression didn't dramatically change, but something in it settled. "You got everything?" she said. "Everything he had. The 2 starred items will come from Denver in 3 to 4 days. She nodded, already moving toward him to take some of the load and sort through it with quick, knowledgeable hands. "That might be all right," she said, half to herself. "I can start the initial protocol with what we have and add the second compound when it arrives. It's not ideal sequencing, but it can work." "Will it work?" Silas asked. She looked at him directly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to know it can work in theory before I know it works in practice. And I need it to work in practice before I know if we have enough time." She set a bottle on the table and picked up another. "What I can tell you is that the animals who are still standing have more fight in them than I expected. Your herd is hardier than average." "Mountain bred," Silas said. "My father selected for it. It shows." She uncorked a vial and held it to the lantern light and looked at it. "The one's in the worst condition. There are 3 I'm genuinely uncertain about. Bella, I think, will make it. She's breathing better this morning than yesterday." "She's stubborn," Silas said. "I know," Martha said, and he heard in those 2 words an echo of the previous night's conversation that she probably didn't intend to leave audible. The treatment protocol that Martha implemented over the following days was nothing like the patent remedies Silas had burned money on in the fall. There was nothing quick or theatrical about it. It was slow, painstaking, carefully sequenced work that required attention to each animal individually. Different dosages calibrated to weight and condition, observation periods between administrations, records kept for each animal in a dedicated section of her journal. She showed Silas, Pete, Danny, and Frank what to watch for between her own monitoring sessions, so that the animals were effectively under continuous observation through the daylight hours. She didn't ask permission to take over the barn. She didn't apologize for reorganizing the supply cabinet to suit her work or for commandeering the work table, or for the fact that her instruments and her bottles and her journals occupied what had previously been empty space. She simply did what needed doing, and the ranch accommodated her the way running water accommodates the shape of what it moves through. Danny, in particular, became something close to a devoted assistant. He had the natural aptitude of someone who is good with his hands and interested in understanding things, and he absorbed everything Martha explained with a speed that she acknowledged with the slight nod she used to indicate that something was going as she'd intended. "He's good," she said to Silas on the third morning. "He listens without translating everything through what he already thinks he knows. That's rarer than people realize." "He's young," Silas said. "Youth has nothing to do with it," she said. "You do it too." Silas wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he didn't. On the fourth day, the first of the severely sick animals died. It was the older cow, the one Pete called Marigold and who had been the most compromised when Martha began treatment. She went in the early morning quietly, and Pete found her when he came in for the first check. He came to the house and told Martha without embellishment, and Martha put down her coffee and went to the barn, and Silas followed. She stood at the stall door and looked at the animal for a long moment. Her face was doing the controlled inward thing, but underneath it he could see something that wasn't scientific. She'd spent time with this animal every day for 4 days. She'd sat with her the way she'd sat with Bella. "I knew it was possible," she said. "The infection load was too advanced when I started. Her system couldn't—" She stopped. Started again. "I knew it was possible." "Martha," he said. "I'm fine," she said. Not defensively, just stating the condition. "I know you are," he said. "I'm still sorry." She looked at him. She seemed to consider several responses and find all of them inadequate. She settled for a single nod and went back inside to start the morning's work. That afternoon, Silas was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard horses on the main road. He set down the axe and walked around to the front of the property and felt his jaw tighten when he recognized the rider coming through the gate. Hank Pryor, Mercer's foreman. Big man, wide in the shoulders, with a way of riding that expressed entitlement without trying to. And behind him, 2 other men Silas didn't know, both wearing town clothes rather than ranch clothes, which meant something. Silas walked to the middle of the yard and stopped. Pryor pulled his horse up and looked down at Silas with the comfortable ease of a man who's used to being larger than the people he's talking to. "Boone," he said. "Pryor, what do you need?" "Just riding through. Mr. Mercer asked me to check on how things were going up here." His eyes moved past Silas to the barn. "Heard you had a new arrival." "My wife," Silas said. "She's working." Pryor shifted in the saddle. Mr. Mercer wanted to convey that his offer still stands. Given the circumstances, he might even consider improving on the original number. He said this with the careful neutrality of a man delivering a practiced line, out of neighborly concern. "Tell Mr. Mercer that I appreciate his concern and that the ranch is not for sale." Pryor looked at him for a moment with an expression that acknowledged the script had proceeded as expected. Then his eyes moved to the barn again. "What's she doing in there?" "Treating the herd," Silas said. "With what?" "That's ranch business," Silas said. One of the 2 men behind Pryor exchanged a glance with the other. Both of them had the quality of men who were listening more carefully than their postures suggested. "Who are they?" Silas said, looking past Pryor. "Associates of Mr. Mercer," Pryor said. "In town for business." "This isn't town," Silas said. Pryor smiled the smile of a man who didn't mind conflict because he expected to win all of them. "Just being neighborly, Boone. We'll let you get back to it." He turned the horse, and the 3 of them rode back down the road. Silas watched them until the tree line took them. He was still standing there when Martha appeared at the barn door. She'd seen them. Of course she'd seen them. She saw everything from that window. "The foreman?" she said. "Pryor," he confirmed, "with 2 men I didn't recognize." "What did they want?" "To see what we're doing," he said, "and to remind me the offer stands." Martha was quiet for a moment. "They know something's changed," she said. "They're not worried about a sick herd. Sick herds are proceeding exactly as intended. But a woman treating that sick herd, someone who might actually know what she's doing, She stopped. How long before Mercer comes himself? When he thinks it'll be effective, Silas said. He doesn't make trips that don't accomplish something. She nodded slowly. Then we need to move faster than I'd planned. She disappeared back into the barn. That evening, Pete returned from his 2-day ride to the county seat at Silver Fork. He came in looking road-worn and handed Silas a folded paper and poured himself coffee and sat down heavily. The paper was a copy of the land records for the parcels surrounding Broken Summit. Martha had asked Pete to get them 3 days ago when she'd been building her documentation. Silas spread it on the kitchen table and looked at the chain of ownership marked in Pete's notes across the top. 4 ranches. All of them had changed hands in the last 3 years. All of them were now controlled by Mercer's Consolidated Cattle Company, bought at prices that the county records, when Pete had compared them to the assessment rolls, were between 40 and 60% below assessed value, and all 4 of them had experienced herd sickness in the 18 months before Mercer bought them. Silas set the paper on the table and stared at it. He's been doing this for years, he said. Pete sat with his coffee. Long enough to get good at it, he said. Martha came in from the barn, reading something in her journal as she walked, which was a habit that Silas had already mentally cataloged as a genuine risk for door frames. She stopped when she saw the paper on the table. She came to look at it without asking what it was. She read Pete's notes. She looked at the names of the ranches, the dates, the prices. Her face was very still. All 4? She said. All 4, Pete said. She sat down. She set the journal on the table and put both hands flat on it and looked at the far wall for a long moment. Something was happening behind her eyes that Silas couldn't entirely read. Not emotion exactly, or not only emotion. Calculation. The reshaping of a picture that was now larger than she'd had it before. He has a system, she said. This isn't opportunism. This is a method. He's been refining it. She looked at the paper again. The Whitfield place. Frank mentioned the Whitfields. Tom Whitfield sold to Mercer last spring, Silas said. Sick herd the winter before. Is Whitfield still in the area? He took his family to Boise, Pete said. I know where. Martha looked at him. If we could get a statement from Whitfield, his account of what happened with his herd, the timeline, what the sickness looked like. She stopped herself. That's a lot to ask for. He sold the land. He moved his family. Going back over that publicly. Tom Whitfield was a good man, Frank said from the doorway, where he'd come in without anyone noticing, which was Frank's persistent habit. Mercer broke him. He knows it. I think he'd talk. Everyone looked at Frank. You knew him well? Martha said. Well enough, Frank said. We rode together for a season before I came to work here. He was angry when he left. The kind of angry that doesn't go anywhere. It just sits there. He looked at Martha steadily. If someone was giving it somewhere to go, I think he'd take the trip. Martha looked at Silas. Boise is 4 days' ride, Silas said. Frank could telegraph first, Pete said. Save the trip if Whitfield isn't willing. Do it, Martha said. Then, catching herself, if Silas agrees. Do it, Silas said. Frank left for town in the morning. The ranch went on without him, the way a ranch goes on. The work redistributing without ceremony, Pete absorbing the extra feeding rounds, Danny taking the fence check, Silas covering 2 jobs where he'd been covering 1. Martha worked through it, steady as a fixed point while the rest of them moved around her. On the 5th day, Bella stood up. It happened in the mid-afternoon, and Danny saw it first and came out of the barn at a pace that was not quite running because he was trying not to jinx it. He found Silas at the woodpile and said, with the careful voice of a young man trying to be measured about something he was not measured about at all, You should probably come see this. Bella was on her feet in the stall, standing not well, legs slightly splayed, head lower than normal, the uncertain stance of a body relearning balance, but standing. She was eating hay. She was eating with the deliberate, focused attention of an animal that had decided to eat and was committed to the project. Martha was standing at the stall rail with her arms resting on it and her chin on her arms, watching the heifer eat with an expression that she clearly thought was neutral and which was not even close to neutral. Silas stood beside her and didn't say anything. Her temperature is almost normal, Martha said. She still needs monitoring. The others, she gestured at the two animals sharing the barn. The gray is responding. The brindle I'm still not sure about. But this one, she stopped. Silas waited. This one I was sure about, she said. From the first day. She had too much fight in her, I was sure. You sat with her, he said. I talked to them, she said, slightly stiffly. It helps them. I know that sounds... Pete does it, he said. I know, she said. He's a good man. They stood there for a moment, watching Bella eat, and Silas was aware of the quality of this moment. The warmth of the barn, the smell of hay, and the faint antiseptic smell of Martha's work, the sound of a heifer eating who 4 days ago had been on the floor. He was also aware that he was standing close enough to Martha that he could see the line of her jaw and the stubborn set of her mouth, and the dark circles that were still there under her eyes. He'd stopped thinking of her as the woman from the stagecoach, the one Mercer had mocked, and the one he'd been vaguely embarrassed about in the beginning, in the first hour before she'd started talking. He wasn't sure exactly when that had shifted. Somewhere between the water sample and the ride up the ridge, probably. Or maybe the night she'd sat at his kitchen table and said she had been trying to prove this for 2 years. Are you eating enough? He said. She turned to look at him, surprised by the question. I've noticed, he said, that you eat when you remember to and you forget to remember when you're working, and you've been working for 5 days almost without stopping. She considered him for a moment. I eat adequately, she said. You ate 1 biscuit this morning, and it was yesterday's. She opened her mouth, closed it. I'm making supper, he said. Actual supper. You'll sit at the table and eat it. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an assumption. Then she looked back at Bella. All right, she said. He made a proper meal. Salt pork and beans and cornbread from scratch. Nothing remarkable, but hot and substantial. Martha sat at the table and ate all of it, which he took as evidence that she had been more hungry than she'd admitted. Pete ate in comfortable silence. Danny ate fast and went back to the barn to check the animals without being asked, which made Pete look at Silas with an expression that said something about the young man's evolution over the past week that neither of them put into words. After supper, Martha sat at the table with her coffee and didn't immediately pick up a journal. This was so unusual that Silas noticed it. What are you thinking about? He said. She looked at the coffee cup. The timing, she said. Ferris's reply, if it comes, will arrive a week before the bank date. That gives us 1 week to do something with whatever he sends. She turned the cup in her hands. And we still don't have direct evidence connecting Mercer personally to the contamination. The sacks, the boot prints, the land records, they tell a story, but a good attorney can complicate a story. She paused. Real is a good attorney. So what do we need? Silas said. We need the source, she said. Where those organisms were cultivated. Who prepared the material in the sacks? She looked up. Mercer has a man of science on staff, you said. Do you know his name, where he operates from? Silas thought. I heard him mentioned once at the cattlemen's meeting, last fall. Someone asked Mercer about his herd health program, and he mentioned a name. I didn't know it, some Eastern name, and said the man worked out of a facility on the north property. He paused. The north property is the Mercer holding that borders my ridge. Martha was very still. The same ridge, she said, where someone has been coming down to access your spring. Yes, Silas said. They looked at each other across the table. If there's a facility on that property, Martha said slowly, and if that facility has equipment consistent with what was used to cultivate those organisms, she stopped. That's not something I can access. That's on Mercer's land. No, Silas said. I wasn't suggesting. I know what you weren't suggesting, he said. And the answer is still no. We build what we build from our side of the fence. If Whitfield talks, if Ferris responds, if the evidence from the spring and the ridge holds up, it may not be enough, she said quietly, for a sheriff who's been eating at Mercer's table. Then we go above the sheriff, he said. She looked at him. There's a federal land office in Boise, he said. What Mercer's been doing, if we can show it across 4 ranches, with documentation, with Whitfield's account, with scientific analysis from a recognized researcher, that's not a local matter anymore. That's a federal matter. Martha's expression shifted. Not immediately, but in the considered way of someone testing a new frame against what they already know. Federal involvement takes time, she said. More time than we have before the bank date. The bank date is one problem, Silas said. Mercer is a bigger one. If we focus only on the foreclosure, we stop him temporarily and then he does this to someone else. He leaned forward slightly. You've been chasing this for 2 years. You didn't come here just to save one ranch. She was quiet for a long moment. No, she said. I didn't. Then we build the thing that ends it, he said. Not just the thing that stops the clock. Martha looked at him with the evaluating directness that he'd noticed from the first day. The look that didn't flatter and didn't diminish, that simply assessed what it saw. You sound very certain, she said. I'm not certain at all, he said, but I'm not losing this ranch to a man who poisoned my water and laughed at my wife in the middle of the street. The word landed between them, not wife as a legal term or convenience, but as something else, something that had solidified quietly over 5 days of cold mornings and long evenings and shared weight. Martha looked at the coffee cup again. Her expression was not readable in the way he'd come to be familiar with, but there was something in it that was neither her professional composure nor her exhaustion. Something quieter. All right, she said. Then we build it properly. The next morning brought Frank back from town with a telegraph reply from Tom Whitfield that said, in the clipped economy of telegraph language, remember everything. We'll talk. When do you need me? Martha read it twice. She handed it to Silas, and he read it, and he looked at Frank. Well done, Silas said. Frank shrugged in the way of a man who'd done something significant and didn't need a ceremony about it. He was angry when he left, he said. I told you. Martha was already back at her journal, writing. The morning was clear and the temperature had lifted 2 degrees from the week before, and from the far barn came the sound. Silas stopped and confirmed it because he needed to be sure, the sound of Bella moving around her stall. It was a small thing, an old heifer moving around a cold barn stall. But in a week of things going badly or uncertainly or by the narrowest possible margin, the sound of that animal on her feet was the first thing that felt, clearly and without qualification, like the right direction. Martha didn't look up from the journal. I heard her, she said. Tom Whitfield arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after Frank's telegraph. He came on horseback rather than the stage, which meant he'd ridden 4 days from Boise and arrived looking like it, trail-worn, unshaven, with the particular set of a man who'd made a decision and ridden toward it before he could change his mind. He was somewhere around 50, lean in the way of men who'd worked outdoors their whole lives, with a face that had been weathered past the point of showing age accurately. He pulled up in the yard and looked at the ranch with the specific expression of a man who recognized a failing operation because he'd lived in one. Silas met him at the gate. Whitfield, he said. Boone. Whitfield climbed down and shook his hand with a grip that was still strong. Frank said you had something worth hearing. I figured the least I could do was return the favor. He looked at the barn, the corrals, the slope of the mountain. Herd sickness? Was, Silas said. We're pulling out of it. Whitfield's eyes came back to him with a sharpness that the trail dust didn't obscure. How? Come inside, Silas said. There's someone you need to meet. Martha was at the kitchen table with 3 journals open and the remains of a working lunch pushed to one side. She looked up when they came in and assessed Whitfield in the way she assessed everything, quickly, without performing the assessment. Mr. Whitfield, she said, sit down. I'll get coffee. She said it with the ease of a woman in her own kitchen, and Silas noticed this without remarking on it, noticed it the way you notice something that's quietly become true without announcement. Whitfield sat. He looked at the journals. He looked at the microscope, which had migrated from the back room to the kitchen table that morning for reasons Martha hadn't explained. He looked at Silas. Your wife? He said low. Yes, Silas said. Whitfield nodded slowly, taking in more than the word. Martha set coffee in front of him and sat across from him and said, without preamble, I want to ask you about the winter before you sold, specifically about the sickness in your herd. I want to know when the first animal went down, what the symptoms looked like, and where your primary water source was located." Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then he wrapped both hands around the mug and started talking. He talked for 2 hours. Martha listened without interrupting except to ask precise, targeted questions at intervals, not leading questions, questions that opened space for him to fill. She took notes in the journal with her small handwriting. Silas sat at the end of the table and listened, and Pete came in partway through and stood by the stove and listened too. And what emerged from Tom Whitfield's account was a story that mapped, detail by detail, onto what had happened at Broken Summit. The timeline was different, but the shape was identical. The slow onset, the confusion about cause, the veterinarian who'd come and shrugged, the creeping financial pressure as the herd declined, the first offer from Mercer's people, which had seemed low but not insultingly so, the second offer after more animals died, the third offer, which Whitfield had taken because by then there was nothing left to hold with. "My water source was the creek on the north boundary," Whitfield said. "Mercer's land is uphill from it." Martha set her pen down. "Did you know that at the time?" she said. "I knew the geography," he said. "I didn't know what it meant." He looked at his coffee. "My wife knew something was wrong. She said it felt managed. That word, managed. I told her she was imagining it." He paused. "I've had a year and a half to think about that." "Mr. Whitfield," Martha said, "I want to show you something." She took him through it the way she'd taken Silas and Pete and the hands through it. The water samples, the specimens under the microscope, the documented evidence from the spring and the ridge. Whitfield was not a scientist, but he was a man who'd spent his life reading land and animals, and he followed her explanations with the focused attention of someone who is hearing, for the first time, an account of something that happened to them that makes complete sense. When she finished, he sat back and was quiet for a long moment. "He poisoned my water," he said. "The evidence indicates that someone did," Martha said, "and that the method and the organisms used are consistent with what was done here." "It's the same man," Whitfield said, not a question. "I believe so," she said. Whitfield looked at the table. Something moved through his face that was not simple or clean, grief and rage mixing in the proportions of a man who'd spent a long time with both and still hadn't found a ratio that worked. "I sold for 40 cents on the dollar," he said. "My father built that place. My kids grew up on it." Nobody said anything, because there was nothing useful to say. "What do you need from me?" he said, finally. "A written statement," Martha said. "Detailed. Timeline, symptoms, your water source location, the sequence of Mercer's offers, and when they came relative to the herd decline, signed and witnessed." She looked at him steadily. "And I need you to be willing to repeat it if this comes to a formal proceeding." "It'll come to a formal proceeding?" "I intend for it to," she said. Whitfield looked at Silas. "She always like this?" "Since the first day," Silas said. Something in Whitfield's expression settled. "All right," he said. "Give me paper." Pete produced the ranch's formal ledger paper, and Whitfield wrote his statement in a slow, deliberate hand at the kitchen table, while Martha reviewed her notes and cross-referenced the timelines. And Silas made a second round of coffee because the afternoon was going cold and the work was not finished. The statement took 3 hours to complete. When Whitfield was done, he signed it, and Pete witnessed it, and Silas witnessed it, and Frank, who had come in from the barn at some point without anyone marking the moment, witnessed it too. Whitfield looked at the signed pages. "Is this going to do anything?" he said. "Mercer has people in this county. The sheriff has been to his house for dinner. Reel has papers on file in Silver Fork that probably have more legal weight than anything we put on that table." "Not on their own," Martha said, "but we're not done." "What's left?" "A letter from a scientific authority that corroborates the biological evidence," she said. "And one more thing I haven't been able to secure yet." She hesitated, which was unusual for her. He'd come to see her hesitations as genuinely significant because they were rare. "The source facility, where the organisms were cultivated. If we can establish that Mercer maintained a facility with the equipment and materials necessary to produce what was found in those sacks—" "The north property," Whitfield said. Martha looked at him. "I know that land," he said. My eastern fence ran adjacent to it for 20 years. There's a building up there, Sab. I always thought it was a storage facility. Heavy timber construction sits back from the tree line. I saw men coming and going from it, maybe 3, 4 times over the years. Never thought to ask about it. He paused. I could tell you how to find it. Martha and Silas looked at each other. You said we stay on our side of the fence, Martha said to Silas. I said that, he said, and I agreed with you. You did. A pause. But if someone who owns adjacent land wanted to ride his own boundary line, Silas said slowly, and happened to observe from a legal vantage point what was on the neighboring property, that wouldn't be trespass, Pete said from the stove, studying his coffee. That would not be trespass, Silas confirmed. Martha looked at him with the evaluating look. You can see the building from the Whitfield fence line? On a clear day, Whitfield said, with a good glass. Silas looked at the window. The afternoon light was going. Tomorrow morning, he said. Early. They rode out at first light, Silas, Whitfield, and Pete, with Martha insisting on coming and Silas not arguing because he'd learned in 10 days that arguing with Martha about whether she was going somewhere used time he didn't have. She rode adequately rather than well, managing the terrain with the same careful determination she brought to everything physical, and she didn't mention it. The Whitfield fence line ran along a ridge that gave a clear view down into the adjacent valley on the north property. They tied the horses below the tree line and went the last section on foot, and Whitfield led them to a point where a rock outcropping created natural cover and a sight line through the trees. He pointed. The building was there. Heavy timber, as he'd described, set back from a clearing about 300 yards from their position. From this distance, it looked like a large outbuilding, longer than a standard barn, with 2 small windows and a chimney that was, even in the morning cold, producing a thin trickle of smoke. Someone was in there. Martha had brought her field glass, the same one from her satchel, and she trained it on the building with steady hands. Ventilation pipe on the east side, she said, without lowering the glass. Not for heat. The diameter is wrong for a heating pipe. That's an exhaust system. For what? Whitfield said. For a controlled environment, she said. Temperature and air quality management. The kind of setup you'd need to maintain organism cultures through a mountain winter. She lowered the glass slowly. Her face was very still. There's a man at the window. Can you see him? Silas took the glass. The figure at the window was visible for only a moment before stepping back. A narrow man in a dark coat, the kind of coat a professional wears rather than a working man. I've never seen him before, Silas said. I have, Whitfield said quietly. Silas gave him the glass. Whitfield looked. That's the man who came to the ranch with Reel the second time Mercer made an offer. He was introduced as a consultant. Mercer said he advised on herd health. Martha took the glass back. She looked at the building again, then at the approach to it, the path from the ridge, the angle of the terrain. She was mapping something in her head. That's not a herd health consultant, she said. That's a laboratory. They rode back to the ranch in the kind of quiet that comes from having seen something that confirms what you feared was true. Whitfield left that afternoon for the ride back to Boise with a promise to return if needed and with a copy of his statement in the inside pocket of his coat. At the gate, he stopped his horse and looked at Martha. My wife will want to know about you, he said. Martha looked at him. She said it felt managed, he said. She's been carrying that for 1.5 years without anyone believing her. He adjusted his grip on the reins. When this is settled, was one way or another, would you be willing to write to her, just to tell her what you found, just so she knows she was right? Martha was quiet for a moment. I'll do better than write, she said. I'll put her name in the documentation as the first person to identify the pattern correctly. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and rode out. The letter from Dr. Edmund Ferris arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after Pete had ridden to town with Martha's letter and 6 days before the bank foreclosure date. Silas heard the horse in the yard and came out to find Pete dismounting with an envelope in his hand that was not standard post. It was the kind of paper and seal used for official correspondence, thick and formal, and it had a Colorado Agricultural Experimental Station mark on the upper left corner. He took it inside without opening it. Martha was in the barn. He went and got her and didn't say what it was. She followed him to the kitchen, saw the envelope on the table, and stopped. She sat down. She picked it up and looked at the seal for a moment, as if measuring what was inside before committing to opening it. Then she broke the seal and unfolded 3 pages of close-written correspondence in a large, angular hand. Silas sat across from her and watched her read. She read slowly, which he'd come to understand meant she was reading carefully, not that the reading was difficult. Her face moved through several states he'd learned to parse: the controlled assessment, the internal calculation, and then, near the end of the second page, something that was neither of those things. "He's coming," she said. Silas leaned forward. "He's coming in person," she said. She looked up from the letter. "He says—" She stopped and looked back at the page. "He says the specimens I described in my letter are consistent with a cultivated strain his station identified 3 years ago and believed had been contained. He says if what I've found is what he thinks it is, it represents a deliberate weaponization of a livestock pathogen." She set the letter down. Her voice was completely even, and her face was controlled and her hands were flat on the table. "He's already contacted the Bureau of Animal Industry in Washington. He's bringing a federal agent with him." The kitchen was very quiet. "How long?" Silas said. 5 days, she said. "He wrote this 6 days ago. He may be in transit already." 5 days. That was 1 day before the bank date. "It's not enough," Silas said, doing the arithmetic. "Even if he arrives in time, the bank doesn't defer a foreclosure because a scientist is in transit." "I know," Martha said. "Mercer will be here on the foreclosure date with Real and the bankers, and—" "I know," she said again. "We need to buy 1 day." She looked at the letter again. "Who holds the note? Which bank?" "Mountain Territorial," he said. "Frank Aldress runs the Ridgeline branch." "Have you ever had a good relationship with Aldress?" Silas thought about Frank Aldress, who was a cautious man and a fair one, who'd extended the note twice already, and who had looked genuinely uncomfortable at the cattlemen's meeting when Mercer had talked about Broken Summit's prospects. "Decent," he said. "Then go talk to him," Martha said. "Not about the fraud, not yet. Just about an extension. 1 day. Tell him you have a circumstance in transit that materially affects the property's value, and you need 24 hours. She picked up the letter and folded it. "Don't mention Mercer. Don't mention federal involvement. Just ask for 1 day. Aldress might say no." "He might," she said. "But he also might say yes, and right now 1 day is the difference between everything and nothing." Silas rode to town the next morning and sat across from Frank Aldress in the small, overheated office at the back of Mountain Territorial Bank and made his case. He didn't lie. He said there was a development pending that would significantly affect the situation at Broken Summit, and that he needed 24 hours past the deadline to allow it to materialize. Aldress looked at him for a long time. "This development," Aldress said, "does it involve Calvin Mercer?" Silas paused. "What makes you ask that?" Aldress looked at his desk. He was a small man in a good suit with the careful manner of someone who had spent a career managing the gap between what people said and what they meant. "Mercer has spoken to me twice in the past 2 weeks," he said carefully. "He is very interested in the resolution of your note." "I imagine he is," Silas said. Aldress looked at his hands. Then he said, with the particular neutrality of a man choosing his words on a narrow path, "I can defer the formal proceeding by 24 hours for administrative purposes. It's within my authority to do so." He looked up. "That's all I can do." "That's all I need," Silas said. Aldress nodded once. "Good luck, Boone." Silas rode back to the ranch and told Martha, who received the news with the same controlled expression she received most things, and then immediately started writing a letter to the county land registrar in Silver Fork, which meant she was already 3 steps ahead. The next 5 days at Broken Summit were the kind of days that compress in memory because they were both endless and too fast simultaneously. Martha completed her documentation, the full scientific record, organized chronologically and cross-indexed, running to 47 pages in her precise handwriting, with copies of the specimen photographs and the field diagrams and the annotated timeline of the herd decline, and Whitfield's signed statement appended at the back. She gave Silas the original and made 2 copies herself, working by lantern light 2 nights in a row. her hand cramping enough that she switched to her left on the second night for 2 hours and continued. He found her doing this at midnight on the second night and stood in the doorway. "Let me help," he said. She looked at her left hand, at the page, at the copying work remaining. "Can you write legibly?" she said. "Legibly enough." She passed him the pages and he sat down and started copying. They worked side by side for 2 hours, the only sound the scratch of two pens and the occasional shuffle of pages. And Silas thought about the fact that 3 weeks ago he hadn't known this woman existed, and now here they were at midnight with the ranch's whole future balanced on 47 pages of scientific documentation and the arrival of a train from Colorado. "Martha," he said. She said, not looking up. "When this is over," he said, "whatever way it goes, I want you to know—" "Oh, don't," she said, not unkindly. "I haven't said anything yet." "I know what you're going to say," she said, "and I'd rather you say it when we know how this ends. Things said before a battle have a way of feeling different after one." She turned a page, one way or another. He wasn't sure if that was wisdom or self-protection. Probably both. He kept copying. Dr. Edmund Ferris arrived on Friday evening, one day before the bank date and one day after the extension Aldris had granted. He came on the stage. He was 60, compact, with close-cropped white hair, and the alert, unconventional manner of a man who had spent decades looking at things most people couldn't see. And he was accompanied by a man named Calder, who wore a government suit and had the patient, contained manner of a federal officer who had seen a great many things and was professionally unmoved by most of them. Martha met them at the stage stop. Silas stood back and watched the reunion. It was not warm in the way of people who had parted on good terms. It was the more complex warmth of two people who had had a significant professional relationship, some portion of which had been difficult, and who had arrived at a mutual respect that was real but earned. Ferris shook her hand and then looked at her with the evaluating attention of a teacher who is assessing whether his former student is as good as the letter suggested. "Show me what you have," he said. She showed him that evening at the kitchen table, while Calder sat quietly and took notes in a small book. Ferris went through the documentation with the focused intensity of a man reading his own language, asking questions that were narrow and precise, and that Martha answered without hesitation. At several points, he asked her to walk him back through a specific measurement or collection method, and she did so with the patience of someone confident enough in her work to welcome scrutiny. At the end of 2 hours, Ferris sat back and looked at Calder. "This is consistent with the Ridgeback strain," he said. "The thermal tolerance data matches what we documented in our 1879 paper. The cultivation markers in the sac samples," he tapped a page, "this isn't wild-caught. This was grown in a controlled environment." He looked at Martha. "Your documentation is thorough, better than thorough." "I had time to prepare," she said. "You had the right instincts," he said, "which is what the station never wanted to give you credit for." He said this simply, without performance, the way a man states a fact he has decided not to avoid anymore. "I should have argued harder for your position." "You couldn't have known it would come to this," she said. "No," he said. "But I knew your work was good. That part I could have argued." He turned to Calder. "What do you need from your end?" Calder looked up from his notes. "A site inspection of the facility on the north property, if we can secure access legally. The documentation here is strong enough to support a warrant, in my judgment. I'll wire Washington tonight and request authorization." He looked at Silas. "The foreclosure proceeding is tomorrow morning?" 10 o'clock, Silas said. "Then we need to move quickly in the morning," Calder said. He had the methodical certainty of a man who had done this before. "I'll want the local sheriff present, not because I need him, but because excluding him creates problems." "The sheriff is—" Silas started. "Complicated," Martha said. "I understand," Calder said without expression. "I've dealt with complicated sheriffs. Let me handle that." He wired Washington from the telegraph office that night, and the authorization came back before morning, which meant someone in Washington had been waiting for this. The night before the foreclosure, Silas couldn't sit still. He walked the ranch in the dark, the yard, the barn, the fence line along the south field. The cattle were quiet. Bella was in the east paddock now, fully on her feet, moving with a wariness that wasn't yet confidence but was getting there. The gray had recovered. The brindle was still uncertain but had eaten that morning, which Martha had noted in the journal with the same handwriting she used for everything, and which Silas had read as a better sign than she'd let it be called. 7 of the original 12 were going to make it. He'd stopped counting deaths and started counting survivors. He stopped at the paddock fence and looked at Bella in the dark. "We're not done yet," he told her. She looked at him with the flat and curious gaze of a heifer who had fought an invisible enemy for 3 weeks and survived it, and was not particularly interested in sentiment. He went back inside. Martha was at the table. "You should sleep," he said. "I will," she said. "In a bit." She had the documentation stacked in front of her, the original and both copies, organized and sealed. She'd put them in a leather case that she'd stitched a carrying strap onto with her own hands, a practical solution to a practical problem. "Silas, if this doesn't go the way we need it to go tomorrow—" "Martha." "Let me finish," she said quietly. "If it doesn't go the way we need, I want you to know that the documentation exists in 3 places now and that Ferris has the copy. Whatever happens to this ranch, the record exists. It won't disappear." She looked at him. "Mercer doesn't win permanently, even if tomorrow is bad." "Tomorrow isn't going to be bad," he said. He wasn't certain of this, but he said it the way you say the things that need to be said before a hard morning. She looked at him for a moment. "I found something else," she said, "when I was organizing the final documentation tonight." He waited. "In the specimen samples from the second set of sacks, the ones from the ridge, the unused ones," she opened the journal to a marked page. "I found a secondary marker I hadn't identified in the first samples, a mineral residue, specific to the cultivation medium used to keep the organisms viable." She turned the journal toward him. "That mineral signature is not from your mountain. It's not regional geology. It's a manufactured compound used in laboratory incubation procedures. Which means the organisms weren't just cultivated in a controlled facility. They were cultivated in a specific type of facility, using a specific type of process, and the signature of that process is detectable in the material." She tapped the journal page. "Ferris confirmed it tonight. He's seen the signature before, in samples from a laboratory fire in Denver in 1881. The same compound, the same source." Silas stared at the journal page. "The Denver fire," he said. He dredged up the memory of something he'd read years ago in a newspaper. A laboratory burned. Someone died. "A researcher named Costigan," Martha said. "He was working on parasite cultivation for agricultural applications. The fire was ruled accidental." She looked up. "Ferris said Costigan's assistant disappeared after the fire. Was never accounted for." "The man in the building on the north property," Silas said. "I don't know that," Martha said. "But Calder does now. I told him an hour ago." She closed the journal. "He made a second wire to Washington." Silas sat down at the table across from her. Outside, the mountain was dark and still. And tomorrow was coming whether they were ready or not. 7 cattle alive in his barn. 47 pages of documentation in a leather case with a hand-stitched strap. A federal officer asleep in the bunkhouse next to Dr. Edmund Ferris, who had come from Colorado to say out loud what Martha had been saying for 2 years. "I think we have enough," Silas said. "Almost," Martha said. She turned one more page. "We have enough for tomorrow. What comes after tomorrow is going to take longer." "I can live with longer," he said. She looked at him across the table. "So can I," she said. The morning of the foreclosure came in gray and cold, the way serious mornings often do in the mountains. No drama in the sky, just a flat pewter light that made everything look like it had been waiting a long time. Silas was up at 4. He didn't try to sleep past 3:30 because there was no point. He dressed in the dark and built up the stove and stood at the kitchen window with coffee and watched the yard take shape as the light came slowly in. The barn, the corrals, the east paddock where Bella stood at the fence rail looking back at him with the mild and curious patience of an animal who has survived something and moved on from it. He heard Martha's door at 5. She came out already dressed, hairpinned, carrying the leather documentation case by its stitched strap. She set it on the table and poured coffee and sat down and looked at the case and didn't say anything. Neither did he. They sat like that for a while, which was one of the things Silas had come to understand about the particular way they occupied the same space. They didn't need to fill it. It had taken him a week to stop being surprised by this, and another week to be grateful for it. Pete came in at 5:30. Then Danny, who was moving with the contained energy of someone young enough that tension expressed itself as readiness rather than dread. Frank came last, quietest, and stood by the stove and drank his coffee without sitting down. Ferris appeared from the bunkhouse at 6, looking like a man who had slept adequately and thought better for it. Calder was behind him, already in his government coat, already carrying his document case. He'd wired Washington twice more through the night. Pete had ridden to the telegraph office at midnight on his behalf. And both times responses had come back within the hour, which meant people at the federal level were awake and paying attention to this, and had been for longer than yesterday. "The sheriff," Calder said when he came in. "I need to speak with him before 10. "He'll be with Mercer," Silas said. "Probably," Calder said. "That's fine. I'd rather speak with him in that context than pull him away from it. Men behave more honestly when they're with the people they're trying to protect." Silas looked at him. "I've done this before," Calder said, without arrogance, just stating a fact. They rode into Ridgeline at 8:30. Silas and Martha in the wagon, the others on horseback, the leather case in Martha's lap. The town had the heightened, slightly suspended quality of a place where something is about to happen, and most people know it, but nobody is saying so directly. There were more horses at the rail in front of the bank than a Tuesday morning warranted. Silas recognized two of Mercer's hands, and a man he knew worked for Real's office. He also recognized, standing near the post office with his hat in his hands and a look of concentrated anxiety, Tom Whitfield. Silas pulled the wagon up and looked at him. "You came back." "Told you I would," Whitfield said. "My wife made me." He looked at Martha. "She said if I didn't show up, she'd make the trip herself, and she's more frightening than anything Mercer's got." Martha looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, but was its direct neighbor. "Thank her for me," she said. They tied the horses and went to find the sheriff. Sheriff Dale Purcell was a heavy man in his 50s who wore his authority in the particular way of someone who had held a position long enough to confuse it with a personality. He was standing on the boardwalk outside the bank with Mercer and Real and two men from Mountain Territorial, all of them in the cold morning air with the clustered ease of people who expected the next hour to confirm what they already knew. Mercer saw Silas first. Then he saw Ferris and Calder, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear, not yet, but the alertness of a man who recognizes unexpected variables. He looked at the government coat on Calder. He looked at Real. Real was already looking at Calder with the focused attention of an attorney identifying a problem. "Boone," Mercer said, his voice carrying its usual easy volume. "This is more of a party than I expected." "Mr. Mercer," Calder said, stepping forward before Silas could speak. He produced his credentials from his inside coat pocket and held them out. Not aggressively, just plainly, the way you present something that speaks for itself. "My name is James Calder. I'm an agent with the Bureau of Animal Industry, operating under federal authority. I'd like a few minutes of your time and Sheriff Purcell's time before the 10 o'clock proceeding." Purcell looked at the credentials. His face went through several things in quick sequence. Mercer said, "I'm not aware that a bank proceeding requires federal involvement." "It doesn't," Calder said pleasantly. "The proceeding can go forward as scheduled. I have a separate matter to discuss that happens to be relevant to the parties present." He looked at Purcell. "Sheriff, do you have somewhere we can speak privately?" Purcell looked at Mercer. This was the thing Silas had worried about. The look, the implicit question, the years of dinners and handshakes and accumulated obligation flowing in one moment between two men. But Calder was watching Purcell too, and what he said next was quiet and direct and addressed only to the sheriff. "This concerns a federal investigation into deliberate contamination of livestock water sources across 4 counties. I think you'll want to hear it before the proceeding rather than after." The word federal did what it always does. It changed the geometry of the room. Purcell said, "My office is 2 doors down." They went 2 doors down. Silas stayed outside with Martha and the others. Mercer stayed on the boardwalk with Reel, and the two of them spoke in voices too low to carry, and Reel's face had the careful, controlled expression of an attorney who is very quickly recalculating. Martha stood beside Silas with the leather case in both hands. "How long?" Silas said. "As long as it takes," she said. It took 40 minutes. When Purcell came back out, he looked like a man who had aged 5 years in less than an hour. He looked at Mercer with an expression that was complicated. Not accusatory, not yet, but no longer the easy, comfortable look of a man who knows which side of a thing he's on. Calder came out behind him and said, to no one in particular but in a caring voice, "I've asked Sheriff Purcell to delay the foreclosure proceeding pending review of evidence material to the property's valuation and legal status." He's agreed. The bank officers have been informed. Reel said, "On what authority?" "Federal authority," Calder said, with the patience of a man who has said this before and will say it again without irritation. "The relevant statutes are in the documentation I've provided to the sheriff. Mr. Reel, if you'd like to review them, I'm happy to walk you through them." Reel did not look happy. He looked at Mercer. Mercer was looking at Martha, not at Silas, not at Calder or Ferris. At Martha, who was standing with the leather case and her plain brown coat and her traveling bonnet that had seen better days, the same woman he'd mocked in the middle of this same street 3 weeks ago. His expression had changed from what it had been on the boardwalk. The easy amusement was gone. What was there instead was something harder and more calculating. The expression of a man who is running numbers and not liking the results. Martha looked back at him without changing her expression at all. Calder said, "I'll need to speak with Mr. Mercer next, and with you, Mr. Reel." He looked at the attorney. "I'd recommend having your own counsel present. Not Reel, independent counsel. I'm giving you that advice as a courtesy." Mercer said, "I don't know what you think you have." "We can discuss that inside," Calder said. The next 2 hours unfolded with the particular grinding pace of legal and official process, which is not dramatic in the way that anticipation makes you expect. There were no raised voices, no confrontations that escalated into something physical. What there was instead was documentation and the slow, methodical application of evidence to the people who needed to be shown it. Ferris presented his scientific analysis to Purcell and the 2 bank officers in Purcell's office. He was exact and clear and completely authoritative, and when he said that the organisms found in the Broken Summit water supply were a cultivated strain whose production required specialized knowledge and equipment, and that the secondary mineral markers in the sac samples matched a laboratory process associated with a specific facility in Colorado, Purcell listened with the expression of a man who is resorting a great deal of information very fast. Martha sat beside Ferris and provided the field documentation, the collection records, the water sample analysis, the specimen photographs, the annotated timeline. She answered questions from Purcell's deputy without hesitation, and when the deputy asked a question she'd heard before, she answered it in slightly different and clearer terms than the first time, because she understood that the goal was not to perform competence, but to transfer understanding. Whitfield gave his statement in person, standing in Purcell's office with his hat in his hands, and when he described the sequence of events on his ranch, the sickness, the offers, the sale, and connected it to the geography of the water source and the Mercer land uphill from it, the room was quiet in the particular way of people absorbing something they had suspected but not confirmed. Silas watched Purcell during Whitfield's account. The sheriff was a man who'd made a career of practical accommodations, of knowing which way the weight was distributed in any situation and positioning himself accordingly. Silas had known him for 15 years and had no particular grievance with him beyond the general grievance of watching a man choose comfort over principle enough times that it became his character. But watching him listen to Tom Whitfield, a man who had lost his father's ranch and moved his family to another city and ridden 4 days to stand in this office and tell the truth about it, Silas saw something shift in Purcell's face that was not calculation. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you've been telling yourself a story about something for long enough that hearing the true version is a physical experience. Reel, to his credit, asked good questions. He was a competent attorney, and he probed the documentation for weaknesses with the professional thoroughness of someone doing his job rather than defending a friend. Martha answered every question. Ferris answered every question. When Real challenged the chain of custody for the sack specimens, Martha produced the witness signatures, Pete, Danny, Frank, Silas, from the ranch log documentation session, and the dates and the photographs. Real looked at the photographs for a long time. The building on the north property, Calder said, at the point where the documentation had been fully presented. I have a federal warrant to inspect it. I'll be going out there this afternoon with the sheriff. He looked at Purcell. I'd like you to come personally. Purcell said, yes. Not I suppose, or if you think it's necessary. Just yes. Mercer, who had been present for part of the proceeding and absent for parts of it, taken into a separate room with Real, and coming back with a face that had been progressively losing its composure, said, when Calder announced the warrant, that property contains confidential business operations. You don't have the right. The warrant is issued under the Animal Industry Act of 1884, Calder said. The right is established. He looked at Mercer without particular animosity. Mr. Mercer, I'd like to give you the opportunity to make this easier rather than harder. For everyone, including yourself. Mercer looked at Real. Real said nothing, which was itself an answer. Mercer's composure, which had been his most consistent asset for as long as Silas had known of him, that settled, amused, untouchable quality, broke in the particular way that things break when the force against them finally exceeds the structure. Not dramatically, not with noise, just a visible fracturing, like ice on a warming river, the surface beginning to show what had always been underneath. I want to speak with my attorney, he said, and his voice was flat in a way that had nothing to do with calm. Of course, Calder said. They were given the room. Outside on the boardwalk, Silas stood next to Martha in the cold February air, and the town moved around them. People going about their Tuesday, a few of them slowing down when they passed because the cluster of horses and official-looking figures outside the sheriff's office had been visible all morning, and people in small towns noticed these things. Ambrose Kelly came out of the general store and looked at Silas and then at Martha and then at the scene in general, and his expression was the expression of a man assembling a picture from its parts. Silas nodded at him. Ambrose nodded back. Martha set the leather case down on the boardwalk bench because it was heavy, and she'd been holding it for 2 hours. She sat beside it, and the tension that had been in her body since early morning, that particular held-in quality of someone who has been on high alert for too long, released slightly, not completely, but enough to see. Silas sat beside her. It's not over, she said. I know, he said, but it's going the right way. Things can still fall apart, she said. Real is good. If Mercer has the right kind of resources and the right kind of patience, he can complicate this for a long time. He can complicate it, Silas said. He can't make the evidence disappear. She looked at her hands in her lap. No, she said. He can't do that. Calder came out at noon and told them the bank proceeding had been formally suspended pending federal review of the property's legal encumbrance status. The bank officers had agreed without much resistance. They were not Mercer's people. They were Mountain Territorial's people, and their interest was the note, not the outcome, and they were not going to fight a federal agent over an administrative delay when the alternative was being associated with a fraud investigation. The note was not forgiven. It was not erased. But it was suspended, which meant the ranch was not being seized today, and today was the day that had mattered. Purcell rode out to the north property that afternoon with Calder and Ferris and 2 deputies, and what they found in the heavy timber building confirmed what the documentation had indicated, and then exceeded it. The man Whitfield had identified as Mercer's consultant. His name turned out to be Avery Stills, and he had indeed worked under the researcher who died in the Denver laboratory fire, attempted to destroy materials when he heard the horses in the yard, and managed to burn perhaps a third of what was there before the deputies got the door open. 2/3 was enough. Ferris spent 3 hours in that building, and when he came out, his face was set in the particular way of a scientist who has found what he was looking for and is not happy about it. It's a full cultivation laboratory, he told Calder on the ride back. Equipment I haven't seen outside of a major research institution. Stills knew what he was doing, probably better than the man he worked under. He paused. There are records, partial because of the fire, but enough to show a production timeline going back at least 4 years. 4 years, Calder said, at minimum. Silas did the arithmetic in the saddle, counting back 4 years, counting the ranches he knew had changed hands, the families he knew had left the valley. It was more than 4. Stills was taken into federal custody that evening. 2 days later, after a conversation with Calder that lasted several hours and to which Reel was not admitted, Mercer was arrested on charges including deliberate contamination of livestock water sources, fraudulent acquisition of property, and conspiracy under the animal industry statutes. The charges were federal, which meant they went to a court that was not located in Silver Fork and did not share a dinner table with the defendant. Reel filed papers. Reel filed more papers. Reel was very good at filing papers. None of the papers made the evidence disappear. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about the legal process was fast or clean, and Silas would be the first to say that what he'd expected, some clear, definitive moment of vindication, was not what he got. What he got instead was a long, grinding, procedural unwinding of a complicated fraud conducted by people in offices in Boise and eventually Washington who he'd never meet, centered on documentation that Martha had spent 2 years and then 3 weeks assembling on a kitchen table in a mountain ranch. The banknote was restructured under the federal review. The assessed value of the property, with the fraud removed from the equation, was recalculated by the county land office at a figure that made the existing terms manageable rather than impossible. It was not a gift. It was not a rescue. It was the numbers corrected to reflect reality, which is a different thing. The 4 ranches Mercer had acquired through the scheme became the subject of a separate federal proceeding regarding fraudulent acquisition. The Whitfield land was among them. What would eventually happen with those properties was not yet clear when the snow began to melt on Broken Summit in early April. These things move at their own speed, but the fact that they were in proceeding meant they weren't Mercer's anymore, which was a start. Tom Whitfield came back to Ridgeline twice in the spring, both times to give depositions. The second time he brought his wife, a small, direct woman named Clara, who shook Martha's hand and held it for a moment and said, "You believed something was wrong before you had the evidence to prove it. That's not science, that's character." Martha seemed uncertain what to do with this, which Clara appeared to understand and changed the subject to the cattle. The herd at Broken Summit recovered. Not all of it. 7 of the 12, as Silas had counted, and 7 was what they had going into spring. But the contamination was gone from the water source, the spring running clean now, as Martha had confirmed with samples collected weekly for 2 months, and the 7 animals that had made it were mountain-bred and stubborn, and in Bella's case, apparently interested in ensuring that everyone knew it. Ferris returned to Fort Collins with copies of the documentation and published a paper the following autumn in the Journal of Agricultural Science on deliberate bovine parasite cultivation as a method of property fraud. Martha was listed as co-author, which Ferris had insisted on and which Martha had argued about briefly and then accepted. The paper was read by perhaps 300 people in the country. One of them was a rancher in Wyoming who recognized the symptoms described and wrote to the journal address and eventually to Martha directly, which began a correspondence that would continue for years. The name people in Ridgeline used for Martha changed, as names do when the story changes. The mocking version disappeared first. These things don't survive contact with the truth. They just stop being said, which is not the same as being taken back, but is what there is. The new name came from somewhere Silas couldn't precisely identify, possibly Ambrose Kelly, who talked to everyone, possibly Whitfield's Clara, who had a gift for phrasing things in ways that stuck. The woman who saved the valley. Not the fat woman. Not Boone's wife. The woman who saved the valley. Martha knew about it. She didn't mention it. She kept working. There were things about her that didn't change and wouldn't. She still ate when she remembered to and forgot to remember when she was working. She still fell asleep over journals and woke up with ink marks on her wrist from the pen she'd been holding. She still talked to the cattle, which Pete approved of, and Danny now did too, though Danny was less systematic about it. She was not easy to live with in the way that effortless people are easy to live with. She had opinions, and she stated them, and she was right about things often enough that being wrong landed with more weight than it would have otherwise. And she was not graceful about being wrong. She was human about it, which meant she was slightly stiff and correct afterward, in a way that Silas had learned to recognize as her version of an apology. He was not perfect either. He was short-tempered in the mornings before coffee and inclined to silence when the silence would have been better broken, and he held on to worry the way some men hold on to money. Too tight, past the point of usefulness. He had a tendency to assume the worst about how things would go that Martha called a failure of imagination, and that he called experience, and that they disagreed about productively enough that it had become something between a joke and a philosophy. They were married properly in May by a justice of the peace in Silver Fork, with Pete as witness and Danny standing near the door looking moved in the way of young men who are experiencing someone else's life milestone and feeling the weight of their own future in it. Frank stayed at the ranch with the cattle because someone had to, and because Frank was Frank. It was not a romantic ceremony. Martha wore her second-best dress, and Silas wore the coat he used for cattlemen's meetings, and the justice of the peace was a practical man who got through the words at a pace that suggested he had other appointments. Afterward, they ate at the hotel dining room. A good meal, not a celebration in the theatrical sense, but in the quieter sense of people who have been through something together and are sitting down to eat and are glad of it. Walking back to the wagon, Pete said to Silas, in the private way of men who've worked together long enough that they speak in shorthand, "You know what your father would have said." Silas thought about his father, who had built the ranch with bad lumber and determination, and who had died believing it was the best thing he'd ever made. "He would have said I was lucky," Silas said. "He would have said more than that," Pete said. Silas looked at Martha walking ahead of them to the wagon, the leather case over one shoulder. She had the documentation with her. She nearly always had the documentation with her. She was working on a follow-up correspondence to Calder about the Whitfield proceedings, and her hat slightly crooked in the wind, and her attention already somewhere Silas would have to ask about later. "Yeah," he said. He would have. There's something that people who've never been truly desperate tend to misunderstand about the nature of rescue. They imagine it as a rival, someone coming who has what you need, who solves the thing that's broken and leaves the situation corrected. What it actually is, in the cases that matter, is more like recognition. Someone shows up who sees the problem clearly, who is not distracted by what the problem looks like, or who is carrying it, or whether the person carrying it fits the shape of someone who should be helped, who simply sees it and applies their best knowledge to it and refuses to stop when the stopping would be easier. Martha Calloway did not save Broken Summit Ranch because she was a scientist. She saved it because she was paying attention when everyone else was looking elsewhere, because she understood that the thing presenting itself as bad luck was in fact a decision someone had made, and that decisions leave evidence, and that evidence, properly gathered, is more powerful than anything you can buy or intimidate or laugh off a stagecoach step. She had known this for 2 years before she arrived on that step. She had carried it through offices that dismissed her and institutions that underpaid her, and a world that had a very specific and limited idea of what a woman who looked like her could know or do or be worth. She had not been made smaller by any of it. That is not a simple thing. It is not something that happens naturally or easily or without cost. Anyone who has carried real knowledge in a body that the world keeps telling them disqualifies them, understands the particular daily labor of it, of staying intact, of not beginning to believe the verdict that's being handed down around you. Martha stayed intact. She came up the mountain with her trunks full of instruments and her journals full of evidence and her mind full of 2 years of work. And she did not ask anyone's permission to know what she knew. That was the thing about her that Silas never stopped being struck by. In the years that followed, when the ranch was healthy and the legal proceedings were concluded and Broken Summit had become the kind of place his father had believed it could be. Not that she'd been right, that she'd stayed right in the face of every reason to doubt herself, and that she'd applied that rightness practically and precisely to the problem in front of her, and that the result was 7 cattle who'd survived something they weren't supposed to survive, and a ranch that stood when it had been engineered to fall. He said something like this to her once, in the late spring, sitting on the porch after supper when the mountain was doing the thing it does in May, the light going gold on the high slopes, the smell of snowmelt coming down through the pines. He said he didn't know how to tell her what it meant, what she'd done, in a way that was adequate to the actual size of it. She sat with this for a moment in the way she sat with most things, not dismissing it, but turning it over, checking it from different angles. "You let me work," she said finally. "That was most of it." "That's not most of it," he said. "It is," she said. "You don't know how rare that is." He thought about that for a long time after, about what it said, not about him, but about everything that had come before him, about all the offices and institutions and well-meaning dismissals that had made the simple act of being allowed to do your work feel like something that had to be noted, like a gift instead of a given. The mountain was quiet around them. Bella was in the east paddock, visible from the porch, doing nothing in particular with the satisfied competence of an animal who had decided to go on living and had gone on living and considered the matter settled. "I'm going to need more supplies from Denver," Martha said after a while. "I've been corresponding with a rancher in Wyoming about a case that looks like it might be similar to what happened here. I want to be ready if he needs me to come out." "Wyoming," Silas said. "It might not come to that," she said, "but if it does." He looked at her, and she was already reaching for the journal, the pen coming out of her coat pocket with the automatic ease of a reflex, and he thought about the leather case in the front room and the correspondence stacked on the kitchen table and the second journal she'd filled since May, and the way Ferris had ended his paper with a footnote that said simply, "Field Analysis by M. Calloway Boone, Broken Summit Ranch, Idaho Territory." "Write your list," he said. She was already writing. The mountain held the light for another half hour and then let it go, the way mountains do. Without drama, without announcement, just the slow and inevitable turning of the day into whatever comes next.